I slid the black leather binder across the white linen tablecloth. The friction produced a dry scrape that cut through the low jazz playing in the dining room. Inside that folder sat a single sheet of paper detailing the exact dollar amount my blood relatives stole from me. I leaned back against the upholstered chair, rested my hands in my lap, and watched my father flip open the cover. The color vanished from his cheeks, leaving his skin the hollow shade of old parchment. He came to this dinner thinking he was going to trick me into a financial bailout. He did not know I was here to seize his house. But before I tell you how a man who spent his entire life projecting authority suddenly folded over a dinner plate, drop your age in the comments, and welcome back to Amanda Told Stories. My name is Autumn Patel. To understand the weight of that restaurant silence, we need to rewind 7 days. I live in Vermont. My mornings smell of roasting coffee, wet cedar, and the sharp bite of pine needles. As the financial director for a regional agricultural cooperative, my daily existence relies on balanced ledgers, sustainable crop yields, and unbreakable order. I built a fortress of quiet, and it took immense effort to construct. 7 years ago, I backed a rusted sedan out of my parents' driveway. I had exactly $200 folded in my wallet. I left behind a sprawling suburban house choked with performed wealth. The breaking point arrived when they demanded I drain my modest savings to fund my sister Naomi and her extravagant wedding. When I said no, my mother Diane performed her signature sigh, treating my boundary like a personal insult. My father Neil branded me unstable. My departure earned no apologies, no pleas to stay. Neil stood on the front porch, hands resting on his hips, and let out a short, tight laugh. "You will never detach your name from mine, Autumn," he called out, his voice echoing down the manicured street. "You are nothing without my backing." I gripped the peeling steering wheel, put the car in drive, and embraced the silence. Over the next 7 years, I carved out a life where my name belonged wholly to me. I traded their exhausting theatrics for the rolling green mountains. I traded their empty status symbols for the tangible reality of artisan agriculture. The people I work with measure value in crop rotations and honest labor, not in country club memberships. My life became clean, predictable, and remarkably quiet. That quiet held steady until last Tuesday. The winter air outside my cabin had frozen the surface of the lake into gray iron. Inside, a fire popped in the hearth, casting warm light across the oak floors. I was asleep. At 11:14 at night, my phone screen illuminated the dark wood of my nightstand. The caller ID showed a localized Vermont number I did not recognize. I let it ring, assuming it was a misdial. The screen went dark. Then it lit up again with a text. Then another call. I turned over and closed my eyes, refusing to let an unknown number dictate my rest. By sunrise, the notification badge on my screen displayed a staggering figure. 43 voicemails. I pushed the heavy quilt aside and walked into my kitchen. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I did not rush to the phone. I started my coffee grinder, the loud whir filling the space. The familiar routine grounded my thoughts. I poured the hot coffee into a ceramic mug, then tilted a glass jug, watching thick amber local maple syrup ribbon into the dark liquid. I took a sip. Then I tapped the phone screen and pressed play on the first message. It was Naomi. Her voice started with a forced, sugary sweetness that felt alien in my kitchen. "Autumn, it is, Naomi. I know it has been a long time, but we are in the area and really need to catch up. Call me back." I leaned against the counter and let the audio play through the sequence. The theatrics had not changed. By voicemail 12, the fake sweetness dissolved into irritation. Autumn, this is ridiculous. Pick up your phone. We have a family emergency and you cannot just ignore us. By voicemail 28, she deployed the tears. She spoke of ruined timelines of duty, of how much our parents were suffering without me. She tried to weave the old spells of guilt that used to work so well when we were younger. By voicemail 43, left at 4 in the morning, her voice pitched high with breathless panic. Dad is losing everything. You have to call me back right now. It is your turn to step up. I stood by the window watching the early light hit the fresh snow outside. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not shake. They called me unstable 7 years ago. They threw me away over a wedding budget. Now they were hunting me down in the middle of the night, leaving dozens of frantic recordings like a debt collector trying to breach a gate. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the phone to dial her back. Instead, I carried my coffee to the dining table, opened my laptop, and created a blank spreadsheet. Methodically, I began logging the timestamps and durations of each voicemail, row by row. I noted the shifts in her tone, categorizing the manipulation tactics in a separate column. I listened to the sharp intake of breath before her final demand and typed the word escalation into the adjacent cell. For 7 years, I had prepared for the possibility that they would run out of money and come looking for mine. My financial models accounted for market dips, supply chain failures, and crop blights. Now, I simply applied that same risk assessment to my own blood. It was not a sister listening to a sibling. It was an auditor examining a liability. The avalanche had finally found me. But as I saved the document, I realized something important. I was no longer standing at the bottom of the mountain. They thought they could bring their chaos into my quiet woods. They had no idea I already knew how to freeze them out. I drove to the agricultural cooperative headquarters under a heavy sky the color of crushed slate. The building is a restored 19th century timber barn. It smells of roasted coffee beans, dried lavender, and aged cedar. It is a space designed for labor and growth. When I pushed through the heavy glass front doors, the peaceful atmosphere fractured. My receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, stood behind the front desk with a tight, uncomfortable smile. She shot me a look of pure relief. Sitting on the rustic wooden bench in the waiting area was Naomi. My older sister looked absurd. She was draped in an oversized cream wool coat that belonged on a Milan runway, not in a working Vermont agricultural hub. The fabric was pristine, untouched by real weather, and entirely impractical. She did not stand up when she saw me. She did not offer a greeting. She did not open her arms for a hug. Instead, she looked down at her feet and let out a sharp sigh. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to find this place?" She snapped, her voice echoing too loudly against the exposed wooden beams. "And look at this!" She pointed a manicured finger at her footwear. "These are $900 Italian suede boots. The salt on your walkways just ruined the toes." I looked down at my own feet, clad in scuffed, insulated waterproof boots. "Salt keeps people from breaking their necks on the ice, Naomi. It serves a function." She rolled her eyes, standing up to brush invisible dust off her coat. "You always were obsessed with function over form." "I need to talk to you. Now!" I was not going to let her turn my professional sanctuary into a stage for her drama. I nodded toward the door. "We are going down the street." The walk to the local cafe was only 2 blocks, but the winter air made it a trial for her. The wind whipped down the narrow street, biting at her exposed neck. Naomi shivered uncontrollably, her thin coat offering zero protection against the raw chill. I walked beside her in comfortable silence, insulated by my heavy parka. I controlled the environment. She was out of her depth, and we both knew it. We stepped into a small, dimly lit coffee shop. The air was thick with the scent of dark roast and cinnamon. I guided her to a distressed oak table in the back corner, far away from the other patrons. I ordered a black coffee. Naomi ordered an overly complicated vanilla latte with almond milk, tapping her fingernails against the wooden table while we waited. The rhythmic tapping was a tell. It was the same anxious rhythm she used as a teenager, right before she asked our parents for a car upgrade or a designer dress. Once the mugs were placed in front of us, she leaned forward, dropping the complaining facade. Her face shifted into an expression of calculated vulnerability. "Things are terrible at home, Autumn," she began, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Dad is pacing the floors until dawn. Mom cries every time the phone rings. They are facing financial ruin. The business took a hit, investments dried up. It is bad." I kept my expression neutral. Growing up, Neil and Diane never spoke about money unless they were using it as a weapon to control my choices. For them to be crying over ringing phones meant the illusion of their sprawling suburban wealth was cracking. "You vanished on us 7 years ago," Naomi continued, her voice gaining a slight edge of accusation before smoothing back into fake warmth. "You walked away. But Mom and Dad are willing to forgive that. We are willing to let the past go because right now, family needs to step up." I analyzed her phrasing. She framed my independence as a sin they were magnanimously forgiving. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn the back of my throat. "I am listening," I said quietly. She took a deep breath. "I started a business, a lifestyle brand called Naomi Core. It focuses on curated home aesthetics and wellness products. It is right on the verge of exploding. I have the vision, the marketing, the audience, but scaling requires capital." I knew her history. Naomi had never held a real job for more than 6 months. She hopped from one expensive hobby to another, always funded by Neil and his deep pockets. Now she was playing entrepreneur. "The commercial banks are being rigid," she explained, her fingers wrapping tight around her ceramic mug. "They want a guarantor, someone with pristine credit, zero debt, and a stable corporate title. Someone like a financial director." She reached across the table. Her hands were trembling. The tremor was subtle, but I caught it. "I just need you to co-sign the commercial loan, Autumn. That is it. A signature. The capital will allow Naomi Core to launch its spring line. The revenue generated will be more than enough to bail out Mom and Dad. You sign the paper, my brand succeeds, and you save the family. It is your turn to save them." I stared at her shaking fingers. A decade ago, that plea would have worked. The ingrained childhood conditioning would have suffocated my logic. I would have felt the imaginary duty to protect the people who constantly belittled me. I would have picked up the pen to buy their temporary affection. But I was not that girl anymore. I was an auditor. I looked at her dilated pupils, the sweat forming at her hairline despite the chill in the cafe, the desperate tremor in her hands. She was not a sister asking for a favor. She was a bad investment, pitching a high-risk liability. If she truly wanted to save our parents, she would have asked for a direct loan. But she wanted me to tether my pristine credit to a vague lifestyle brand. I withdrew my hands from the table and rested them in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I offered 0 anger, 0 guilt, and 0 comfort. "I need to see the financial statements," I said. Naomi blinked. The sudden shift in my tone caught her off guard. "What?" "The profit and loss statements," I clarified, keeping my voice flat and professional. "The balance sheets from the last 4 quarters, your cash flow projections, inventory valuations. If you want me to leverage my personal credit for a commercial loan, I need to audit the books." Her posture stiffened. The vulnerable facade cracked, revealing the panicked entitlement underneath. You cannot be serious. I am your sister. This is an emergency, Autumn. I do not have time to compile a corporate portfolio for you. My accountant is handling all of that. Then tell your accountant to forward the PDF files to my email, I replied. You are unbelievable, she hissed, her voice rising above the background jazz. Dad is losing his health over this. Mom is breaking down, and you are asking for spreadsheets? You always were a cold, calculating machine. I stood up, leaving a $5 bill on the table to cover my black coffee. I did not pay for her latte. Send the documents, Naomi. Until I see the numbers, the answer is no. I walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door chiming lightly behind me. I stepped back into the freezing Vermont air. She expected me to react with emotion. She expected a tearful yes or a screaming match. She did not expect an audit. As I walked back to my cedar-lined office, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an email notification. Naomi had sent the files. She thought the numbers would satisfy me. She had no idea the data was about to become the shovel I used to bury her lies. I returned to my cabin as the sun dipped behind the green mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the pristine snow. My printer hummed in the corner of the living room, spitting out the attachment Naomi had sent. It was 42 pages long. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and carried them to my dining table. The oak surface was smooth, polished by years of my own quiet labor. I built a fire in the hearth. The logs popped, sending tiny orange sparks up the black stone chimney. I sat down, smoothing the messy, misaligned pages. Naomi had scanned them sideways out of order, hoping the sheer volume of disorganized data would overwhelm my senses. She relied on fatigue. I relied on order. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out a promotional pen from the agricultural cooperative. It was cheap blue plastic, the white logo rubbing off the side, a highly functional tool worth maybe 10 cents. It felt weightless in my fingers. I clicked the top. That sharp plastic click echoed in the silent room, signaling the start of the autopsy. I began with the cash flow statements for her so-called lifestyle brand. The company claimed to sell curated aesthetics and wellness products, but the ledger told a story of pure financial hemorrhage. Line by line, I dragged the cheap blue ink across the columns. Operating expenses were highly inflated. Inventory purchases did not match gross sales. The margins were not just thin, they were subterranean. I found a luxury vehicle lease buried under travel and logistics. I found exorbitant dining receipts categorized as client acquisition. I turned to the bank transfer logs. Here, the narrative shifted from simple incompetence to deliberate deception. Naomi claims she needed a guarantor to save our parents from impending ruin. But the outgoing wire transfers did not point to Neil or Diane. They did not point to any mortgage company or medical facility. They pointed to an external account. I traced the routing number, matching it to a secondary ledger printed on page 37. The primary beneficiary was Connor. Connor was my brother-in-law. He wore pastel polo shirts, spent his afternoons adjusting his golf swing, and treated inherited wealth like a rapidly renewable resource. He had the financial literacy of a teenager holding a stolen credit card. When they got married, Neil bought Connor a junior executive title at a logistics firm just to keep him occupied. Yet these current books showed staggering weekly distributions wired directly into Connor's personal holding account. $50,000 for consulting fees, $25,000 for market research. Naomi Corr was not a burgeoning entrepreneurial venture. It was a leaking bucket, and Connor was the one punching holes in the bottom. The story she spun at the cafe was a total fabrication. She did not want my pristine credit score to rescue our father from pacing the floors. She did not need capital to save our mother from crying over the phone. She needed my signature to plug the staggering deficit her husband had dug. If I co-signed that commercial loan, the bank would drain my personal accounts the moment Connor defaulted. They were trying to feed me to the wolves to buy themselves another season of upscale country club dinners. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. The background noise was loud, full of clinking glassware, silver utensils scraping against porcelain, and overlapping conversation. She was at an upscale restaurant, spending the very capital she claimed she desperately lacked. "Did you review the portfolio?" she asked, her voice tight with artificial confidence. "I reviewed the 42 pages of disorganized fraud you emailed me," I replied, my tone flat, devoid of any sibling affection. The clinking glassware in her background stopped. "Excuse me. Your operating margins are negative 60%, I stated, tapping the cheap plastic pen against the oak table. Your inventory valuation is a fiction, but the real issue is the external wiring. You bled $90,000 into Connor personal accounts over the last quarter under the guise of consulting fees. Your brand is insolvent. It is not a business. It is a shell." Silence stretched across the cellular network. I could hear her sharp, erratic breathing. "You do not understand how startups work, Autumn. Connor is handling the vendor negotiations. We have to spend money to make money. You are spending money to fund a lifestyle you cannot afford," I corrected her. "The numbers show 0 vendor payments, only direct deposits to a man who does not know how to read a balance sheet." "You are denying the signature," she whispered, the fake sweetness evaporating entirely. "I am denying the signature," I confirmed. "I do not finance sinking ships, and I certainly do not finance your husband." The explosion happened instantly. Her voice shattered the receiver, sharp and vicious. "You selfish, arrogant failure!" she screamed. "You sit up there in the freezing woods, playing accountant for dirt farmers, thinking you are superior to us? You are nothing. You have no husband, no real family, no legacy. You are just a bitter, lonely girl who wants to see her own parents suffer out of pure spite." I held the phone a few inches from my ear, letting her vitriol spill into the empty air of my cabin. Her insults were precision designed to cut deep, to resurrect the insecure teenager who used to shrink into the corners of our suburban home. I felt a phantom weight press against my chest, the heavy, suffocating pressure of childhood guilt. For a fraction of a second, the ingrained conditioning urged me to apologize, to yield, to fix the mess and buy their temporary love. I looked down at the highlighted spreadsheets. The math did not lie. Math did not hold grudges, and math did not manipulate. It offered only unvarnished reality. I trusted my data over her noise. "I suggest you cut his allowance," I said calmly. "Good night, Naomi." I ended the call. The cabin returned to its deep, preserving quiet, save for the crackling fire. I stacked the 42 pages, aligning the edges perfectly, and set the cheap plastic pen on top. The first boundary was officially set, thick and impenetrable. I had exposed her lie and protected my assets. But people who survive on unchecked entitlement do not respect boundaries. They view the word no as a temporary obstacle, a negotiation tactic to be steamrolled. Naomi would not accept this defeat. She would run back to the source of her funding. She would tell Neil that the quiet, compliant daughter had suddenly grown teeth and refused to fall into line. I knew my rejection would not end the conflict. It would simply summon the architect of the madness. I walked over to the hearth and watched the flames consume a dry piece of birchwood, knowing perfectly well that the real storm was already packing its bags and driving north. I drove to the agricultural cooperative headquarters under a heavy sky the color of crushed slate. The building is a restored 19th century timber barn. It smells of roasted coffee beans, dried lavender, and aged cedar. It is a space designed for labor and growth. When I pushed through the heavy glass front doors, the peaceful atmosphere fractured. My receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, stood behind the front desk with a tight, uncomfortable smile. She shot me a look of pure relief. Sitting on the rustic wooden bench in the waiting area was Naomi. My older sister looked absurd. She was draped in an oversized cream wool coat that belonged on a Milan runway, not in a working Vermont agricultural hub. The fabric was pristine, untouched by real weather, and entirely impractical. She did not stand up when she saw me. She did not offer a greeting. She did not open her arms for a hug. Instead, she looked down at her feet and let out a sharp sigh. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to find this place?" She snapped, her voice echoing too loudly against the exposed wooden beams. "And look at this!" She pointed a manicured finger at her footwear. "These are $900 Italian suede boots. The salt on your walkways just ruined the toes." I looked down at my own feet, clad in scuffed, insulated, waterproof boots. "Salt keeps people from breaking their necks on the ice, Naomi. It serves a function." She rolled her eyes, standing up to brush invisible dust off her coat. "You always were obsessed with function over form. I need to talk to you. Now." I was not going to let her turn my professional sanctuary into a stage for her drama. I nodded toward the door. "We are going down the street." The walk to the local cafe was only 2 blocks, but the winter air made it a trial for her. The wind whipped down the narrow street, biting at her exposed neck. Naomi shivered uncontrollably, her thin coat offering zero protection against the raw chill. I walked beside her in comfortable silence, insulated by my heavy parka. I controlled the environment. She was out of her depth, and we both knew it. We stepped into a small, dimly lit coffee shop. The air was thick with the scent of dark roast and cinnamon. I guided her to a distressed oak table in the back corner, far away from the other patrons. I ordered a black coffee. Naomi ordered an overly complicated vanilla latte with almond milk, tapping her fingernails against the wooden table while we waited. The rhythmic tapping was a tell. It was the same anxious rhythm she used as a teenager, right before she asked our parents for a car upgrade or a designer dress. Once the mugs were placed in front of us, she leaned forward, dropping the complaining facade. Her face shifted into an expression of calculated vulnerability. "Things are terrible at home, Autumn," she began, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Dad is pacing the floors until dawn. Mom cries every time the phone rings. They are facing financial ruin. The business took a hit. Investments dried up. It is bad." I kept my expression neutral. Growing up, Neil and Diane never spoke about money unless they were using it as a weapon to control my choices. For them to be crying over ringing phones meant the illusion of their sprawling suburban wealth was cracking. "You vanished on us 7 years ago," Naomi continued, her voice gaining a slight edge of accusation before smoothing back into fake warmth. "You walked away. But Mom and Dad are willing to forgive that. We are willing to let the past go. Because right now, family needs to step up." I analyzed her phrasing. She framed my independence as a sin they were magnanimously forgiving. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn the back of my throat. "I am listening," I said quietly. She took a deep breath. "I started a business. A lifestyle brand called Naomi Core. It focuses on curated home aesthetics and wellness products. It is right on the verge of exploding. I have the vision, the marketing, the audience, but scaling requires capital." I knew her history. Naomi had never held a real job for more than 6 months. She hopped from one expensive hobby to another, always funded by Neil and his deep pockets. Now she was playing entrepreneur. The commercial banks are being rigid, she explained, her fingers wrapping tight around her ceramic mug. They want a guarantor, someone with pristine credit, zero debt, and a stable corporate title. Someone like a financial director. She reached across the table. Her hands were trembling. The tremor was subtle, but I caught it. I just need you to co-sign the commercial loan, Autumn. That is it. A signature. The capital will allow Naomi Corps to launch its spring line. The revenue generated will be more than enough to bail out Mom and Dad. You sign the paper, my brand succeeds, and you save the family. It is your turn to save them. I stared at her shaking fingers. A decade ago, that plea would have worked. The ingrained childhood conditioning would have suffocated my logic. I would have felt the imaginary duty to protect the people who constantly belittled me. I would have picked up the pen to buy their temporary affection. But I was not that girl anymore. I was an auditor. I looked at her dilated pupils, the sweat forming at her hairline despite the chill in the cafe, the desperate tremor in her hands. She was not a sister asking for a favor. She was a bad investment, pitching a high-risk liability. If she truly wanted to save our parents, she would have asked for a direct loan. But she wanted me to tether my pristine credit to a vague lifestyle brand. I withdrew my hands from the table and rested them in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I offered zero anger, zero guilt, and zero comfort. I need to see the financial statements, I said. Naomi blinked. The sudden shift in my tone caught her off guard. What? The profit and loss statements, I clarified, keeping my voice flat and professional. The balance sheets from the last 4 quarters. Your cash flow projections. Inventory valuations. If you want me to leverage my personal credit for a commercial loan, I need to audit the books. Her posture stiffened. The vulnerable facade cracked, revealing the panicked entitlement underneath. You cannot be serious. I am your sister. This is an emergency, Autumn. I do not have time to compile a corporate portfolio for you. My accountant is handling all of that. Then tell your accountant to forward the PDF files to my email, I replied. You are unbelievable, she hissed, her voice rising above the background jazz. Dad is losing his health over this. Mom is breaking down, and you are asking for spreadsheets? You always were a cold, calculating machine. I stood up, leaving a $5 bill on the table to cover my black coffee. I did not pay for her latte. Send the documents, Naomi. Until I see the numbers, the answer is no. I walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door chiming lightly behind me. I stepped back into the freezing Vermont air. She expected me to react with emotion. She expected a tearful yes or a screaming match. She did not expect an audit. As I walked back to my cedar-lined office, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an email notification. Naomi had sent the files. She thought the numbers would satisfy me. She had no idea the data was about to become the shovel I used to bury her lies. 3 days evaporated into the steady rhythm of cooperative labor. Saturday morning brought our largest indoor agricultural exchange of the season. We hosted the weekly market inside a sprawling, refurbished railway depot located at the edge of town. Sunlight angled through the high industrial skylights, illuminating the dust motes dancing above rows of vendor stalls. I walked the wide concrete aisles holding a wooden clipboard. My duties involved verifying booth fee payments, checking inventory logs, and ensuring the local health codes were strictly maintained. I was entirely in my element. The vast depot hummed with a pleasant symphony of commerce. I listened to the low murmur of negotiations, the rustle of paper bags, and the rhythmic thud of wooden crates hitting the cement floor. The air inside the building carried a beautiful, earthy profile. It smelled of damp potting soil, sharp wild garlic, warm sourdough bread pulled fresh from portable ovens, and the rich tang of aged artisan cheese. It was the scent of honest labor and tangible results. I paused by a stall operated by a local dairy farmer, running my pen down a checklist. Then the atmosphere shattered. A suffocating cloud of artificial fragrance invaded my airspace. It was a heavy, synthetic floral perfume thick with chemical jasmine and manufactured rose. The scent clawed at the back of my throat, instantly overriding the delicate aromas of fresh basil and aged cheddar. My stomach tightened before my eyes even registered the source. I knew that suffocating perfume. It belonged to my mother. I turned away from the dairy display. Standing 10 feet away, blocking the center of the aisle, were Neil and Diane. They looked remarkably absurd in this environment. Neil wore a pristine camel hair overcoat layered over a tailored navy suit. His leather dress shoes gleamed under the harsh industrial lights, untouched by the slush outside. Diane stood beside him, draped in a dark mink stole, clutching a designer handbag against her chest like a shield. They were a walking monument to superficial status, standing awkwardly among people wearing flannel shirts, worn denim, and mud-stained work boots. I did not walk toward them. I lowered my clipboard and waited. Neil spotted me. His jaw clenched, the muscles working rapidly beneath his skin. He marched forward, his long strides designed to consume space and project dominance. He was a man who used sheer volume and physical intimidation to bend rooms to his will. Growing up, he frequently engineered arguments in crowded restaurants or busy store aisles. He understood that I possessed a deep fear of public embarrassment. In his mind, an audience was a weapon. He banked on the assumption that I would submit to any demand just to stop people from staring. He stopped, inches from my boots, invading my personal space. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing after 7 years of total silence. He reached inside his overcoat and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Sign the commercial lending forms, Autumn," he ordered, his voice booming across the cheese stall. "You are going to fix this problem your sister created, and you are going to do it right now like a loyal daughter." I looked at the folder, then brought my gaze up to his flushed face. I kept my posture relaxed. My shoulders dropped. I did not shrink away from his towering frame. I told Naomi, "No," I replied, my voice steady and quiet. "My decision is final. Put the paperwork away." Diane stepped out from behind his shadow. She initiated her performance immediately. Her lower lip quivered. She brought a manicured hand up to her collarbone, scanning the nearby shoppers to ensure she had their attention. The vendor behind the cheese counter had stopped cutting a wheel of Gouda. A woman holding a canvas tote bag paused in the aisle. Diane absorbed their curious stares and weaponized them.
"How can you be so cruel to us?"
Diane wailed, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. "Your father cannot sleep. We are facing terrible hardships. We gave you everything. We provided a beautiful home, and you turn your back on your own flesh and blood over a simple signature? You are breaking your family apart." Her wounded mother routine was flawless. A few bystanders cast sympathetic glances in her direction, judging the cold daughter standing before her. 7 years ago, the weight of those judging eyes would have crushed me. I would have felt the burning heat of shame crawling up my neck. I would have grabbed the pen just to make the humiliating spectacle stop. But I no longer cared about the opinions of strangers. I only cared about the data. "This is a working agricultural market," I stated, speaking loud enough for the hovering bystanders to hear. "I do not conduct private financial business in the middle of a public venue. You need to leave." Neil stepped closer, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He was unaccustomed to defiance. He lived his entire life surrounded by people who nodded, agreed, and folded under his pressure. My calm refusal short-circuited his brain. He needed to reassert his patriarchal authority, and his limited emotional vocabulary only allowed for force. "You listen to me," he snarled, lowering his head. "You are going to take this pen. You are going to open this folder, and you are going to sign the guarantor line. I am your father. You do not tell me to leave." He lunged forward. His large hand clamped down hard around my upper arm. His thick fingers dug into the fabric of my insulated jacket, attempting to physically drag me toward a nearby empty display table. The physical contact crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I did not pull away. I did not struggle like a frightened child. I planted my boots firmly on the concrete floor, squared my shoulders, and locked my eyes onto his. I drew a deep breath into my diaphragm and projected my voice with the cold, commanding authority of an auditor halting a fraudulent transaction. "Take your hand off my arm." The words cracked through the depot like a rifle shot. I did not yell. I did not scream. I delivered the command with a sharp, freezing precision that instantly silenced the surrounding 50 feet of the market. The low hum of commerce evaporated. The vendor dropped his cheese knife onto the wooden cutting board with a loud clatter. A dozen faces turned toward us, their casual curiosity replaced by alarm. Neil froze. The sheer commanding force of my voice shocked him. He looked at my face, searching for the terrified teenager he used to control. He found nothing but blank, unyielding Vermont ice. He blinked, confusion washing over his features. Slowly, as if touching a hot stove, his fingers uncurled. He released my jacket and took a half step backward. Diane gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, horrified not by his physical assault, but by the public humiliation of his retreat. "Do not ever touch me again," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on his wide eyes. "And do not ever bring your fraudulent debt into my place of work." I turned my back on them. I did not look at the stunned vendors or the whispering shoppers. I walked down the long concrete aisle toward the administrative office, my strides even and unhurried. I left Neil and Diane stranded in the middle of the market, drowning in the heavy silence they had tried to use against me. Their public shaming tactic had backfired spectacularly, exposing their desperation to the bright morning light. I pushed open the heavy oak door to my office and locked it behind me. The quiet enclosed me once more. I set my clipboard on the desk and poured a glass of cold water. My pulse was steady. I had won the public battle. But as I watched the water settle in the glass, a dark realization crept into my mind. Predators who rely on control do not simply walk away when their prey bites back. They change their hunting strategy. If public humiliation failed to break my boundaries, they would pivot to something far more insidious. They would aim for the one vulnerability they believed I still possessed. They would try to manipulate my conscience. I sat down in my leather chair waiting for the inevitable escalation, knowing their next lie was already being manufactured. Sunday passed in a pristine, snow-muffled silence. I chopped firewood behind my cabin, the rhythmic swing of the heavy steel axe anchoring my thoughts. The sharp bite of the cold air kept my mind clear. I knew my parents. I knew their playbook. The failed ambush at the farmer's market was merely a tactical retreat. Neil and Diane operated on a simple binary principle. If force did not yield compliance, manipulation would follow. They required a new narrative, one where they were the tragic victims and I was the ruthless villain. I carried the split birch logs inside and stacked them near the hearth. As I brushed the bark from my leather gloves, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. A single text message from Diane. I picked up the device. The screen illuminated, displaying a high-resolution photograph followed by 2 sentences. Your father suffered a severe cardiac event this afternoon. The stress you caused at the market pushed his heart past its limit. I stared at the image. Neil lay in a sterile hospital bed, clad in a faded geometric print gown. Wires snaked from his chest to a monitor just outside the frame. His eyes were closed, his skin pale under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Diane had framed the shot perfectly to emphasize his vulnerability, capturing the stark white sheets and the sterile metallic bed rails. A sudden, sharp drop hollowed out my stomach. The biological imperative of a child seeing their parent in mortal danger bypassed my logical defenses. My breathing turned shallow. The ingrained ghost of childhood obligation whispered in my ear, telling me I had gone too far. I had drawn a boundary, and the resulting friction had nearly killed the man who raised me. The heavy, suffocating pressure of guilt threatened to crush the carefully constructed walls of my Vermont sanctuary. I sat down on a wooden dining stool, resting the phone flat on the counter. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, forcing the cold mountain air into my lungs. I held the breath for 4 seconds, then exhaled. When I opened my eyes, the frightened daughter was gone. The financial director took her place. I picked up the phone again and zoomed in on the photograph. In my profession, fraud is rarely hidden in the bold numbers. It lives in the margins, the footnotes, the overlooked details. I subjected my mother's photograph to a rigorous visual audit. My thumb dragged across the screen, magnifying the background. Resting on the rolling tray table next to Neil's bed was a plastic clamshell takeout container. A greasy, translucent stain soaked through the corner of the white paper bag beside it. The hospital cafeteria did not serve meals in unbranded, grease-stained paper. That packaging belonged to a specific delicatessen located 3 blocks from their suburban home. It was Neil's favorite spot for a triple-decker pastrami sandwich. I opened the image properties, accessing the digital metadata. The timestamp read 2:15 in the afternoon. Neil did not suffer a sudden stress-induced heart attack from our Saturday morning encounter. He ate a massive, heavy cured meat sandwich on Sunday afternoon, experienced severe indigestion, and panicked. Diane saw an opportunity. She accompanied him to the emergency room, waited for the nurses to hook up the standard monitoring equipment, and snapped a photograph to weaponize his heartburn. Disgust replaced the fading adrenaline. They were willing to fake a brush with death to extract a signature. I decided to test the limits of their deception. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game, I would control the board. I crafted a response, carefully stripping away my usual analytical tone and mimicking the frantic emotional cadence they expected. Mom, I am terrified. Please tell me he is going to survive. Send me the preliminary hospital bills and the routing information. I want to wire funds immediately to cover his deductible and any specialist copays. I hit send. I was laying a red herring, a diversionary bait designed to make the enemy complacent. I knew Diane. She viewed money as the ultimate apology. Offering to pay the medical bills would validate her victim narrative and trigger her greed. She would perceive my panic as a total victory. Less than 3 minutes later, my phone pinged. Diane did not type a response. She simply attached a scanned PDF document. I opened the file on my laptop. It was the preliminary emergency room invoice sent without a single redaction. Diane was so eager to secure the wire transfer that she neglected to cross out the sensitive data. The document displayed Neil's patient identification number, their current home address, his insurance guarantor details, and the primary banking numbers linked to his healthcare portal. I scrolled down to the diagnostic section. The attending physician had entered a specific billing code. I opened a new tab and ran the alphanumeric sequence through a medical classification database. The result loaded instantly. Gastroesophageal reflux disease, severe acid reflux. The cardiac event was an expensive case of heartburn, exactly as the pastrami wrapper suggested. He had already been discharged. The emergency was a fabricated trap built on a foundation of deli meat and lies. I did not confront them with the truth. An amateur points out the lie. A professional uses the lie to gather intelligence. I now possessed their unredacted financial routing numbers, their insurance guarantor details, and a clear picture of their banking infrastructure. I saved the PDF into a secure encrypted folder on my hard drive labeled Audit Materials. Monday morning arrived with brilliant, blinding sunlight reflecting off the snowdrifts. I drove to the cooperative and settled into my office, pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I organized my desk, placing my laptop in the center. I needed to verify the depths of their financial instability. The fact that Diane was so quick to send a hospital bill for a few $1,000s meant their cash reserves were bone dry. They were desperate for liquid capital, scraping for any available funds while still trying to force me into the larger commercial loan for Naomi. I pulled up the hospital invoice on my secondary monitor. I dialed the billing department utilizing the patient identification number provided on the form. A polite representative answered. I adopted a crisp administrative tone, stating I was calling from a financial management office to clear an outstanding balance for my client, Neil Patel. The representative pulled up the file. I asked a few targeted questions verifying the discharge status and the total out-of-pocket expense. The balance was trivial, barely a ripple in a normal household budget. Yet Diane acted as if this minor bill was a catastrophic hurdle. I thanked the representative and ended the call. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the quiet hum of the cooperative surround me. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, revealing a grim picture. Naomi's business was a hollow shell, funneling cash to her husband. Neil and Diane were staging medical emergencies to extract minor wire transfers, while simultaneously trying to leverage my credit for a larger commercial bailout. The arithmetic of their lives equaled total ruin. My phone remained silent throughout the afternoon. Diane was waiting for the promised wire transfer to hit her account. She was likely sitting in her manicured living room, congratulating herself on a successful manipulation. She thought the prodigal daughter had finally folded under the weight of filial guilt. I had no intention of sending a single cent. As the sun began to set, casting long amber shadows across the timber walls of my office, I knew the silence was about to break. When Tuesday morning arrived and Diane checked her bank balance to find 0 pending transfers, the illusion of her victory would shatter. The realization that I had played her, that I had secured their financial documents without paying the ransom, would ignite a rage far beyond anything I had witnessed at the farmer's market. They would realize the quiet daughter was immune to their guilt. Bereft of private leverage, they would have no choice but to turn outward. They would seek to punish me in the only arena they truly valued, public perception. I closed my laptop, securing the encrypted files. I walked to the window and watched the local farmers packing up their trucks in the fading light. The winter air was still holding its breath. The personal battles had failed. Tomorrow they would summon the extended family, and the campaign of noise would begin. By 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the electronic blockade ruptured. My mobile device sat on the edge of my oak desk, silent, but my desktop computer monitor began to flash with a relentless cadence. The email application birthed unread message notifications in rapid succession. The professional networking tab blinked with inbound connection requests and direct messages. Diane had checked her banking ledger. She realized the anticipated wire transfer was a ghost. Deprived of the ransom, she deployed the extended family. Our relatives operated as a synchronized hive mind. These were aunts, uncles, and cousins who routinely forgot my graduation, ignored my corporate promotions, and viewed my relocation northward as a profound betrayal of their suburban ecosystem. Now they emerged as self-appointed moral arbiters. My inbox transformed into a repository of manufactured outrage. I opened a message from Aunt Valerie. The subject line read simply, Christian charity. The text was a chaotic assembly of misspelled accusations, punctuated by a barrage of crying and praying hand emojis. She demanded I empty my savings to save Neil from his deathbed quoting scripture while ignoring the reality of his pastrami-induced heartburn. I did not draft a reply. I did not explain the gastroesophageal reflux diagnosis. I moved the cursor over her name, clicked a single button, and routed her address directly into the spam folder. The digital interface produced a soft final swoosh. It was the sound of a closing door. An hour later, the assault evolved from private harassment to public theater. A junior accountant forwarded me a link to a social media platform. Naomi had gone live. I clicked the URL, muting the volume, watching the visual performance first. She sat in her pristine, curated living room, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater designed to make her look fragile. The lighting was filtered soft, engineered to capture the solitary tear tracking down her cheek. I unmuted the audio. She spoke in a breathless, trembling cadence, weaving a narrative about toxic siblings and the agony of navigating elder care alone. She never uttered my name, but the implications were precise. She painted a portrait of a heartless executive hoarding wealth in the frozen north while her beloved patriarch fought for his last breath. It was a masterclass in modern virtual manipulation. Naomi wielded her fabricated trauma like a torch, attempting to burn down my reputation. She relied on the consuming, destructive fire of public sympathy. I sat in my office, watching the snow drift against the window pane insulated by the preserving ice of my reality. The comments beneath her video multiplied. Strangers offered prayers. Sycophants validated her grief. Then the inevitable occurred. Her followers discovered my place of employment. My cooperative public profile began receiving one-star reviews. Faceless avatars accused our agricultural hub of harboring an abuser. The online noise was attempting to breach the physical walls of my livelihood. This crossed the threshold from personal annoyance to organizational liability. I could not allow their suburban drama to impact the farmers who relied on this institution. I did not engage online. I did not draft a defensive press release or post a counter video. Amateurs fight noise with more noise. Professionals fight noise with transparency. I drafted a brief email to the Cooperative Board of Directors, requesting an emergency 10-minute session before the lunch hour. The board consisted of individuals carved from the Vermont landscape. Elias, the president, managed a third-generation dairy farm. His hands were perpetually stained with engine grease and soil. Martha oversaw a sprawling organic apple orchard, navigating complex supply chain logistics with ruthless efficiency. These were people who respected data, hard labor, and direct communication. They possessed zero tolerance for superficial posturing. We gathered in the conference room. The space smelled of old blueprints and dark roasted coffee. I stood at the head of the long pine table. I projected the sudden influx of negative reviews onto the presentation screen. I did not flinch, and I did not offer emotional qualifiers. I provided the raw facts. My estranged family is currently experiencing severe financial insolvency, I explained, keeping my vocal tone level and even. They recently demanded I guarantee a high-risk commercial loan for a failing lifestyle brand. When I audited their ledgers and declined the signature, they attempted to extort me using a fabricated medical emergency. I refused the secondary demand. In retaliation, my sister activated her social media following to launch a targeted harassment campaign against this facility. I paused, allowing the information to settle over the room. I recommend we temporarily disable public reviews on our digital platforms, I continued. Furthermore, I ask that we instruct the information technology team to flag any incoming correspondence containing my surname. I apologize for the external disruption, but I assure you, my professional output remains intact. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying the projected analytics. He rubbed his calloused jaw. He did not ask about my feelings. He did not pry into the emotional trauma of familial estrangement. We do not negotiate with online tantrums. Autumn, Elias stated gruffly. You protect the cooperative ledgers. We protect the cooperative reputation. Martha nodded in agreement, waving a dismissive hand toward the screen. Let them shout into the internet, she added. It does not change the price of milk or the yield of the harvest. Tell IT to lock down the comment sections. We back you. The meeting adjourned in under 8 minutes. I returned to my cedar-lined office. The fortress held. The family hurled their loudest, most chaotic fire against my walls, and the Vermont ice simply absorbed the heat without melting a single inch. Their campaign of noise failed to isolate me or jeopardize my career. The silence that followed was heavy with their exhaustion. They had spent all their ammunition on a public spectacle, leaving their private flanks entirely exposed. I sat at my desk and opened the encrypted folder on my hard drive. I stared at the unredacted hospital invoice Diane had so carelessly provided the previous day. I highlighted the routing data, the insurance guarantor numbers, and Neil's patient identification sequence. If their current financial state was disastrous enough to warrant fake heart attacks and social media smear campaigns, the rot ran much deeper than a failing lifestyle brand. I logged into a secured corporate background check terminal, a tool reserved for investigating high-level vendor solvency. The interface glowed with a sterile blue light. I pasted Neil's financial markers into the search fields. I added my own social security number to cross-reference any lingering familial ties I might have missed during my departure 7 years ago. I hit the enter key and initiated a deep structural audit. The loading icon spun, digging through layers of hidden banking data, scanning county clerk records and bypassing consumer-level firewalls. I reached for my ceramic mug, taking a slow sip of the dark roast. The screen flickered as the search query compiled the results. I expected to find a few overdrawn checking accounts or a defaulted secondary mortgage on their sprawling house. I did not expect the devastating string of red text that materialized across the top of my monitor. The algorithm had unearthed a secret buried deep within the architecture of our hometown banking system. It was a secret that permanently altered the trajectory of our bloodline, shifting my role from an estranged daughter deflecting annoyance into a victim of a severe federal crime. I set my coffee mug down. The warm liquid inside rippled, matching the sudden chilling realization taking root in my chest. The sterile blue light of the monitor reflected against the dark glass of my office window. The crimson warning text pulsing across the top of the interface was not a software malfunction. My custom algorithm had tripped a severe discrepancy protocol. I leaned forward and dragged my cursor over the alert. The system had cross-referenced Neil and his financial identifiers with my own personal data. The resulting overlap should have been 0. I severed my fiscal ties to them 7 years ago, before driving away in my rusted sedan. Yet the database highlighted an active tether. I clicked the hyperlink, expanding the digital dossier. A commercial business line of credit populated the screen. The origin date was marked 5 years prior. That was 24 months after my departure. The borrower was listed as a limited liability company titled Horizon Logistics. I had never heard of Horizon Logistics. I scrolled down to the corporate officers. Connor was listed as the primary managing director. My financially illiterate brother-in-law was operating a phantom corporation. But Connor was not the element that triggered the crimson warning text. I moved my eyes to the section detailing the loan guarantor. There, typed in bold black letters, was my full legal name. Beside it was my unredacted Social Security number. The interface displayed the current balance of the account, $85,000. The line of credit was drained to its maximum limit. The available balance was exactly zero. A civilian cannot simply walk into a financial institution and open a commercial account using a stolen identity without triggering multiple security verification protocols. The underwriting department requires physical signatures, notarized identification, and in-person interviews. I checked the origination details to see who authorized this breach. The lending institution was a small regional bank located in my hometown. The authorizing manager was a man named Richard. I knew Richard. I remembered the heavy scent of his cheap cigars and the clinking ice in his scotch glass. He used to sit at our dining room table on Friday nights playing poker with Neil. My father frequently boasted about having the local banking hierarchy tucked inside his suit pocket. He claimed Richard could expedite any application, erase any overdraft, and bypass any bureaucratic red tape with a simple phone call. Neil leveraged that corrupt friendship to bypass the mandatory identity checks. He handed Richard my stolen digits, and Richard stamped the approval without ever requiring me to step foot inside the branch. I needed the primary source document. I bypassed the summary page and downloaded the original scanned PDF application from the Federal Registry. The file rendered on my screen, displaying the scanned paper forms from 5 years ago. I navigated to the final page, scrolling past paragraphs of dense liability clauses. I stopped at the guarantor signature line. Someone had physically forged my name. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the pen strokes. The ink was applied with heavy pressure, but it was the formation of the first letter that betrayed the author. The capital A featured a distinct, exaggerated loop at the apex, a flourish that defied standard cursive instruction. I knew that exact loop. I saw it hundreds of times during my childhood. It was the identical flourish Diane used whenever she signed my middle school field trip permission slips or authorized my absentee forms. My mother sat in her pristine, curated living room, took a pen in her manicured hand, and deliberately signed my financial future away to fund her son-in-law. The physical evidence anchored me. The puzzle pieces snapping together created a deafening clarity. Naomi did not track me down after 7 years of silence because she suddenly missed her sister. Neil did not experience a random health scare to elicit my sympathy. The sudden, frantic bombardment of 43 voicemails was not born from familial longing. I checked the loan maturation terms. The commercial line of credit possessed a balloon payment clause. The $85,000 principal plus accumulated interest was due in full at the end of the current month. The deadline was less than 2 weeks away. Horizon Logistics was a defunct shell. Connor possessed zero capital to cover the debt. They were staring down the barrel of an imminent default. A default on a commercial loan of that magnitude would trigger immediate litigation and the potential seizure of their personal assets, including their sprawling suburban estate. They tracked me down to force me to sign a new loan under the guise of funding Naomi Core. They intended to use the fresh capital to quietly pay off the fraudulent balloon payment. It was a desperate amateur Ponzi scheme constructed by arrogant people who believed they could forever outrun their own incompetence. They needed my signature today to hide the felony they committed 5 years ago. I sat back in my leather chair. A normal person discovering an $85,000 identity theft perpetrated by their own parents might weep. They might experience a profound sense of betrayal or a paralyzing wave of sorrow. I felt none of those things. Any lingering trace of childhood sadness, any phantom weight of daughterly obligation, evaporated into the dry, heated air of my office. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I was no longer navigating a toxic family dynamic. I was not dealing with petty narcissists or emotionally stunted parents demanding unearned respect. I was dealing with federal financial criminals. They committed wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. They weaponized my existence to sustain their illusions. I saved the original application, the signature scans, and the current ledger balances into my encrypted local drive. I created secure backups on 3 separate offline servers. Evidence is only valuable if it remains untouchable. I closed the background check portal and cleared the terminal cache. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. They believed they were hunting a vulnerable, estranged relative who could be bullied into compliance through social media smears and public guilt trips. They had no idea they were actively antagonizing their primary victim, who now possessed the exact documentation required to send them to federal prison. I checked my wristwatch. The digital display read 6:15 in the evening. The silence in the cooperative headquarters was absolute. I was safe behind my corporate firewall, but a predator backed into a corner becomes infinitely more dangerous. Connor knew the balloon payment deadline was approaching. He knew the fraudulent LLC tied back to his name. With my refusal to sign the new bailout loan, his panic would escalate from desperation to sheer recklessness. He could not charm me, and he could not intimidate me in person. But Connor believed he possessed superior technical intellect. If he could not coerce the funds from me directly, he would seek another avenue to extract value from my orbit. I locked my office door and walked out into the freezing Vermont night, unaware that his desperation was about to manifest as a direct digital assault on the cooperative infrastructure. Wednesday morning arrived with a biting frost that coated the cooperative windows in delicate crystalline patterns. Inside the administrative wing, the ambient temperature was meticulously regulated. The space hummed with the low-frequency vibrations of commercial servers and the faint rhythmic clicking of keyboards. I sat at my desk, grasping a warm ceramic mug, evaluating the weekly harvest yields on my left monitor. My right monitor displayed the live traffic of our internal network. When I accepted the position of financial director, I overhauled the entire digital infrastructure. Artisan agriculture is a highly lucrative industry. We curate exclusive contracts with high net worth culinary distributors, seasonal tourism boards, and premium organic grocers. Our proprietary client directory is the lifeblood of our operation. A localized network of this magnitude requires enterprise-grade cybersecurity. I installed rigorous firewalls, automated threat detection, and strict access hierarchies. I built a digital fortress long before I knew my own blood relatives would try to breach the gates. Connor possessed the financial literacy of a child, but he harbored the inflated ego of a suburban prince. He was staring down an $85,000 commercial default. The fraudulent shell company he operated with my stolen identity was mere days away from implosion. Because the public spectacle at the farmers' market failed, and the fabricated medical emergency yielded zero capital, his desperation mutated. He could not charm me. He could not physically intimidate me. Left with no viable offline leverage, he resorted to corporate espionage. At 9:14 in the morning, the digital quiet fractured. Seth was our newest junior accounting clerk. He was fresh out of a local university, eager to please, and relatively inexperienced with sophisticated social engineering tactics. His workstation sat 3 doors down the hallway from my office. Seth handled the preliminary processing of inbound vendor invoices. He filtered the raw supply chain data before it reached my desk for final approval. Connor targeted Seth.
The attack was not a crude, generic spam message.
Connor utilized a spear phishing technique. He registered a fraudulent domain name that closely mimicked one of our primary agricultural equipment suppliers. He swapped a single letter in the web address, a visual trick designed to bypass casual human scrutiny. From that fake domain, he dispatched an email directly to Seth. The subject line indicated an urgent, overdue invoice regarding a recent tractor machinery repair. The message carried a high priority flag and instructed the recipient to download an attached billing portal application to remit immediate payment. The payload concealed within that attachment was a highly aggressive data scraping script. Connor intended to infiltrate our localized server, bypass the administrative permissions, and quietly export our entire proprietary client database. He planned to sell our exclusive distributor contacts to a corporate agricultural conglomerate. A directory of that caliber would easily fetch a six-figure sum on the open market. It was a rapid, illicit payday designed to clear his fraudulent debt and maintain his country club lifestyle. Seth observed the urgent red flag on the email. He read the impending late fee warning. Driven by a desire to perform his duties efficiently, he clicked the attachment. He initiated the download. In a poorly secured network, that single mouse click would have compromised years of localized Vermont labor. The scraping script would have funneled our livelihood directly into the hands of a suburban parasite. But my network was not poorly secured. Before the malicious executable could unpack its primary code, the cooperative intrusion detection system intercepted the anomaly. The firewall identified the unauthorized data extraction protocol and immediately severed the connection. The threat was quarantined within a secure digital sandbox, preventing any lateral movement across our servers. Inside my office, the right monitor flashed. A stark, geometric interface overrode my spreadsheet. A bright red box materialized in the center of the screen, displaying two bold white words: Threat neutralized. I stared at that automated pop-up. It perfectly mirrored my internal state. There was no elevated heart rate. There was no rush of adrenaline or surge of panic. There was only a cold, mechanical efficiency severing a hazardous connection. The red, glowing rectangle was the exact digital manifestation of my emotional detachment. I set my coffee mug aside. I did not run down the hallway to reprimand Seth. The junior clerk had simply made a human error, one that my architecture was explicitly designed to catch. Instead, I assumed the role of incident commander. I locked my office door and initiated a trace protocol. If you are going to launch a cyber attack against a financial institution, you must mask your digital footprints through a complex labyrinth of proxy servers and virtual private networks. Connor was a man who spent his afternoons adjusting his golf swing. He was an amateur, wielding a weapon he barely understood. He purchased a cheap phishing kit and deployed it with staggering arrogance. I opened the cybersecurity dashboard and dissected the quarantined payload. I extracted the originating internet protocol address. I ran the numerical sequence through a geolocation diagnostic tool. The digital trail bypassed the basic routing masks with embarrassing ease. The tracking algorithm pinged a primary internet service provider in my hometown. It drilled down through the regional substations, pinpointing a specific residential node. The coordinates landed squarely on a sprawling 4-bedroom house located in a manicured suburban subdivision. It was the exact address belonging to Naomi and Connor. My brother-in-law sat in his curated living room, sipping espresso, and attempted to rob a Vermont agricultural cooperative. He thought the internet provided an invisible shield. He believed he could reach across state lines, steal my professional assets, and fence them to corporate competitors without ever showing his face. He did not just send a deceptive email. Connor crossed a devastating legal threshold. He violated the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He committed attempted corporate espionage. He executed a documented instance of felony wire fraud. I leaned back in my leather chair. The sheer audacity of his maneuver solidified my resolve. They were no longer simply toxic relatives demanding unearned respect. They were active predators attempting to dismantle my career to cover their own crimes. I did not pick up the phone to scream at him. Yelling provides the enemy with the satisfaction of knowing they struck a nerve. Yelling is a release of tension, and I preferred to keep the tension wrapped tightly around their necks. I took high-resolution screenshots of the blocked payload. I exported the raw server logs detailing the exact timestamp and originating residential address. I compiled the phishing email, the fraudulent domain registration, and the network trace diagnostic into a comprehensive digital portfolio. I dragged these new files into the encrypted folder labeled Audit Materials, resting on my secure drive. The bureaucratic wall I was building grew infinitely higher. The foundation consisted of the $85,000 identity theft perpetrated by my mother. The reinforced steel beams were now supplied by my brother-in-law and his felony espionage attempt. I was constructing a legal barricade so dense and impenetrable that no amount of familial guilt or social media theatrics could ever breach it. I unlocked my office door and walked down the hallway. I found Seth sitting at his desk staring at a warning prompt on his screen. He looked pale, terrified that he had compromised the cooperative. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I informed him that the system functioned exactly as intended and instructed him to forward the suspicious email to the I-2 department for standard archival. I maintained a calm, professional demeanor, ensuring the daily operations of the agricultural hub remained undisturbed. I returned to my cedar-lined sanctuary. The digital storm had passed, leaving the air feeling crisp and highly clarified. I sat down and pulled up the complete dossier. I reviewed the forged signatures, the routing numbers, the fake medical bills, and the intercepted espionage logs. As I analyzed the mounting evidence, a specific memory surfaced. The sterile glow of the monitors faded, replaced by the oppressive humid heat of a suburban summer afternoon, 7 years ago. I remembered the heavy mahogany dining table in my parents' house. I remembered Neil standing in the doorway, his chest puffed with unearned hubris, mocking my departure. Most importantly, I remembered the man sitting at that table, drinking scotch from a crystal glass. The corrupt hometown bank manager who authorized the initial identity theft. The phishing attack proved they were out of offline options. They were bleeding cash and rapidly running out of time. They expected me to remain in a defensive posture, swatting away their attacks from the safety of my Vermont woods. They did not expect the quiet, compliant daughter to go on the offensive. I opened a new encrypted browser window. I typed the name of the secondary predatory lending firm that currently held the fraudulent $85,000 corporate debt. The sharks who bought the loan from the corrupt hometown bank were ruthless, but they were motivated entirely by liquid capital. It was time to stop logging their attacks and start dismantling their infrastructure. I reached for my keyboard, ready to initiate a silent financial maneuver that would permanently sever their strings. I organized the digital evidence into a final, hierarchical structure. The espionage logs containing Connor and his failed phishing script sat in the primary directory. Beside them rested the unredacted hospital invoices exposing Diane and her fabricated cardiac emergency. Below those files, I placed the cornerstone of my defense, the original commercial lending application from 5 years ago. I stared at the scanned document. My eyes bypassed the forged rendering of my own name and locked on to the authorizing signature at the bottom of the page. The ink belonged to Richard. He was the regional bank manager who rubber-stamped the identity theft. Seeing his distinct cursive scrawl did not elicit shock. It acted as a key unlocking a vault I had kept sealed for 7 years. The sterile glow of my dual monitors dissolved. The quiet hum of the agricultural cooperative faded into the background. Suddenly, I was no longer sitting in a freezing Vermont winter. I was standing in the suffocating heat of a suburban July.
The air that day was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of melting asphalt and freshly cut lawn grass.
I stood in the driveway of my childhood home. The rusted door handle of my old sedan burned against my palm. Inside my wallet, I held exactly $200. It was the sum total of my liquid independence. I had just refused to empty my meager savings to fund Naomi and her lavish wedding demands. The refusal triggered a seismic rupture in the household dynamic. I looked back at the front porch. Neil stood in the doorway, blocking the threshold. He did not look like a grieving father watching his youngest child depart. He looked like a triumphant warden. His broad shoulders filled the doorframe, his posture designed to project unyielding authority. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his mouth was twisted into a smirk of supreme confidence. He viewed my departure as a temporary tantrum. He calculated that I would survive on my own for perhaps 3 weeks before the harsh reality of poverty forced me crawling back to his doorstep.
You will never detach your name from mine.
Autumn, he sneered, his voice carrying over the drone of the neighborhood cicadas. You are nothing without my backing. The real world is going to chew you up and spit you right back into this driveway. I did not argue. I did not hurl insults. I simply looked past his towering frame into the shadowy, air-conditioned interior of the house. Through the foyer, I could see the formal dining room. Sitting at the head of the heavy mahogany table was Richard. The bank manager wore a tailored suit, his tie loosened around his thick neck. He was watching the confrontation unfold on the porch with casual amusement. He held a crystal glass in his right hand. As Neil finished his lecture, Richard shifted his weight. The square ice cubes in his drink shifted with him, striking the sides of the expensive crystal. Clink, clink. That sharp, hollow sound etched itself into my memory. In that singular moment, the rhythmic strike of ice against glass taught me everything I needed to know about how dirty money moves. It was the soundtrack of nepotism. It was the audio signature of men who carved up the rules behind closed doors while sipping premium liquor. Richard and Neil operated in a closed ecosystem where financial regulations were merely suggestions and accountability was a burden reserved for the lower classes. They traded favors over steaks and scotch, bypassing systemic safeguards with a casual handshake. They believed I was blind to their network. They thought I was a quiet background prop, lacking the intellect to understand the complex machinery of their corruption. Neil assumed his financial tether was the only thing keeping me tethered to the earth. I opened my car door, slid onto the cracked vinyl seat, and drove away. I left the suffocating heat, the mocking laughter, and the clinking ice in the rearview mirror. The memory receded. The crisp air of my cedar-lined office returned, bringing my focus back to the glowing monitors. 7 years ago, Neil stood on that porch, convinced his network was invincible. But empires built on favors lack structural integrity. When times grew difficult, when Connor started bleeding the family dry and missing the commercial loan payments, the old boys' club fractured. Richard could not hide a delinquent $85,000 commercial default from the federal auditors forever. A favor is only valuable until it threatens the career of the man granting it. To save his own reputation, Richard had to offload the toxic asset. I clicked away from the signature scan and opened a financial tracking terminal. I needed to trace the current location of the fraudulent LLC debt. The hometown bank no longer held the paper. They purged the liability from their ledgers 18 months ago. I followed the digital paper trail, navigating through corporate transfer logs and debt reassignment registries. The path led away from the suburban bank and terminated at a high-rise office building in Chicago. The current holder of the $85,000 note was a secondary predatory lending firm. They were a notoriously fierce outfit. Their business model relied on acquiring distressed commercial debt for a fraction of its original value. Once they owned the paper, they employed ruthless extraction methods, liquidating assets and enforcing strict balloon payments to squeeze every remaining drop of capital from the defaulting borrower. They were corporate scavengers. They were sharks. I studied the firm profile on my screen. Neil and Connor were currently trapped in a cage with apex predators. The Chicago firm did not care about Neil and his booming voice. They did not care about Diane and her designer handbags. They did not play golf with Richard, and they did not trade favors over scotch. They only cared about one metric: cash. My father always believed I was nothing without his backing. He failed to realize that by forcing me out into the cold, I learned how to build my own backing. Over the past 7 years, I cultivated a pristine financial portfolio. I managed millions in agricultural assets. I generated substantial personal capital through disciplined investments and calculated market strategies. I possessed the exact resource the Chicago firm coveted: liquid capital. A standard victim of identity theft would print the forged documents, march into a local police precinct, and file a lengthy, arduous report. They would spend years entangled in bureaucratic red tape, fighting the credit bureaus, while their family denied the allegations and hired defense attorneys. I had no intention of playing the victim. I had no desire to engage in a protracted courtroom drama where Diane could weep on a witness stand and play the misunderstood matriarch. I wanted permanent, unarguable leverage. If the Chicago firm held the leash wrapped around my family, I did not need to sever it. I simply needed to purchase the leash. I opened a secure encrypted communication portal tied to my elite financial network. I maintained discreet contacts within the commercial debt trading sector. I drafted a preliminary inquiry utilizing a blind, limited liability company I established for private wealth management. I masked my identity, operating entirely behind a corporate veil. I requested the purchasing requirements for a specific bundle of distressed commercial paper tied to a defunct entity known as Horizon Logistics. The sharks in Chicago liked cash. I was about to offer them a fresh meal. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. The quiet of the Vermont evening settled around me. Neil built his life on the illusion of control, manipulating everyone in his orbit through the threat of financial ruin. Tomorrow morning, I would initiate a wire transfer that would legally transfer his ruin directly into my hands. The transition from hunted to hunter was nearly complete. I watched the snow begin to fall outside my window, waiting for the brokers in Chicago to open their doors. Thursday morning brought a bitter chill that encased the cooperative windows in a thick layer of frost. While my extended relatives continued their digital crusade, I operated in a vacuum of silence. My phone screen remained dark. The social media notifications piled up in hidden folders, unread and unacknowledged. Naomi likely believed my lack of response indicated submission. She thought the coordinated harassment was wearing down my defenses, causing me to retreat and reconsider her bailout demand. She did not comprehend that silence in the financial sector rarely signifies defeat. Silence is the sound of capital moving. I sat at my cedar desk before dawn. The administrative wing was empty. The only illumination came from the sterile glow of my dual monitors. I initiated a secure, encrypted session with a commercial brokerage firm based in Manhattan. Over my tenure managing agricultural assets, I cultivated relationships with high-level brokers who specialized in distressed commercial paper. They moved millions of dollars across borders before breakfast. My request was minor, a mere footnote in their daily ledger. But they owed me professional favors. I directed my primary contact to establish a blind limited liability company. We named the entity Green Mountain Acquisitions. The corporate structure provided a legally impenetrable veil, ensuring my name remained entirely decoupled from the purchasing entity. Once the shell was registered in Delaware, I authorized the broker to approach the predatory lending firm in Chicago. The negotiation was swift and clinical. The Chicago firm held an $85,000 note tied to a defunct logistics shell operated by an insolvent suburban couple. The balloon payment loomed less than 10 days away. The creditors knew Neil and Connor lacked the liquidity to satisfy the debt. Foreclosure proceedings are expensive, requiring attorneys, court fees, and months of bureaucratic friction. The Sharks wanted a quick exit. When Green Mountain Acquisitions offered to purchase the toxic paper for 18 cents on the dollar, the Chicago firm accepted without hesitation. They preferred a guaranteed fractional payout over a protracted legal battle. I reviewed the digital term sheet. The total acquisition cost equaled $15,300. I did not need a loan to cover that figure. I opened my personal banking portal and initiated a direct wire transfer from my primary savings account. I navigated the cursor over the final authorization button. The prompt asked for confirmation. I paused, looking at the screen. The men who sat around my childhood dining table thought they held the keys to the kingdom. They believed their corrupt networks were invincible. They assumed they could forge my signature, bleed an account dry, and walk away untouched. I pressed my index finger down. The plastic mechanism of my computer mouse produced a soft, distinct click. That tiny sound echoed in the quiet office. It did not sound like a simple technological function. It sounded exactly like the heavy steel door of a cage locking shut. The screen refreshed, displaying a green confirmation checkmark. The wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve Protocol. The Chicago firm released their claim on the paper, transferring full ownership to Green Mountain Acquisitions. The transition was instantaneous and legally binding. The power dynamic inverted in the span of a single heartbeat. Neil and Diane no longer owed $85,000 to a faceless corporate entity in Illinois. They owed the principal, the accumulated interest, and the collateral directly to the daughter they banished 7 years ago. I owned the paper. I owned the leverage. I was legally their primary creditor. I exhaled, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. There was no surge of vindictive triumph. There was no anger. Vengeance is a messy, emotional pursuit that clouds judgment. I was driven solely by a desire for permanent, unshakable peace. The purchase provided the concrete foundation for that peace. I spent the remainder of the morning formalizing the dossier. I printed the newly acquired deed of assignment, placing it alongside the scanned forgery from the hometown bank. I added the network logs detailing Connor and his failed corporate espionage attempt. I topped the stack with the unredacted hospital invoice Diane foolishly sent me to fake a cardiac emergency. The documents formed a flawless chronological narrative of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted cyber intrusion. I slid the files into a thick manila envelope and sealed the flap. At noon, I left the cooperative and drove toward the southern edge of town. The landscape blurred into a sequence of snow-covered fields and bare maple trees. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a local diner. The establishment was a relic of the previous decade, featuring faded vinyl booths and the perpetual scent of grilled onions and strong coffee. It was a place designed for quiet, unnoticed conversations. Sitting in the back corner booth was a man named Thomas. He wore a heavy wool sweater and wire-rimmed glasses. Thomas was a senior investigator for a federal financial crimes task force. I met him 3 years prior during a routine agricultural compliance audit. He was a meticulous man who appreciated pristine ledgers and zero drama. We maintained a mutual professional respect. I slid into the vinyl seat across from him. He ordered 2 black coffees from the passing waitress before turning his attention to me. He noted my calm demeanor and the thick envelope resting on the table. "You requested an off-the-books meeting, Autumn," he said, his voice low and steady. "You rarely step outside the cooperative parameters. What are you holding?" I placed my hand flat against the manila envelope. "I am currently conducting an internal risk assessment regarding a series of fraudulent maneuvers," I replied. "A group of individuals committed identity theft to secure a commercial line of credit. When the balloon payments approached, they attempted a spear-phishing cyber attack against my network to steal agricultural proprietary data. I neutralized the threat, but the core fraud remains active." Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Are the perpetrators linked to a known corporate entity?" "They operate a defunct logistics shell," I stated, keeping my tone neutral. "The primary actors are suburban civilians with a history of leveraging corrupt regional banking contacts." He looked at the envelope. "Do you want to initiate a formal federal inquiry right now?" "Not yet," I answered. I slid the envelope across the scratched Formica table. "These are the preliminary findings. The file contains undeniable proof of forged federal lending documents and logged network intrusions originating from a specific residential internet protocol address. I need you to hold this intelligence. Review the timestamps and the signatures. If the primary actors attempt to flee, or if I give you the signal, you will have everything required to secure immediate indictments." Thomas placed his hand over the package. "You are staging the board," he observed. "You are lining up the pieces before you drop the hammer. Why wait?" "Because an indictment ruins lives," I explained, taking a slow sip of the dark coffee. "I want to offer them a choice. They can surrender their assets to cover the stolen funds and walk away clean, or they can face a federal prosecutor. I am giving them enough rope to decide their own fate." He nodded, slipping the envelope into his leather briefcase. He understood the strategy. The threat of federal prison is often a far more effective tool for asset recovery than actual incarceration. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, discussing upcoming weather patterns and crop yield projections. The transaction was handled with the sterile efficiency of a standard corporate audit. I drove back to my cabin as the afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a brilliant golden light across the frozen lake. The air felt incredibly light. The invisible tether that linked me to my family was severed. I held the scissors, and they did not even know the blade was resting against the cord. I parked my vehicle and walked up the wooden steps to my front porch. The winter wind howled through the pines, stripping dead branches from the high canopy. I unlocked the heavy oak door, stepping into the warmth of my home. I removed my coat, feeling a profound sense of closure settling into my bones. The frantic voicemails, the public ambushes, the digital smears, all of it felt distant and powerless. I walked into the kitchen to start the kettle. I glanced down at the small woven basket sitting on the granite counter, where the local postal worker deposited my incoming letters. Nestled between a generic utility bill and a seed catalog was a thick, heavy envelope. The paper was glossy, pristine white cardstock. The return address was handwritten in a familiar, elegant cursive. The silence of the past 48 hours was not a surrender. They simply realized the noise was ineffective. Deprived of the public stage and desperate for capital, they pivoted toward a new tactic. I stared at the glossy envelope, recognizing the trap before I even broke the seal. The final act was about to begin. I stood in the center of my kitchen holding the parcel. The envelope felt unnaturally stiff between my fingertips. At first glance, the stark white exterior mimicked the premium stationery utilized by high net worth estates. However, rubbing my thumb across the flap revealed the illusion. It was cheap, glossy cardstock. The synthetic coating felt slick and entirely devoid of the textured cotton weave that marks genuine quality. It was a perfect physical representation of my bloodline. They prioritized the superficial appearance of wealth while completely lacking the foundational substance to support it. I walked over to the granite island and retrieved a stainless steel letter opener. The blade sliced through the top edge with a satisfying crisp tear. I extracted the contents, laying them flat under the warm glow of the pendant lights. 3 distinct items rested on the stone counter. The first was a formal invitation printed on the same inferior glossy paper. It requested my presence at an upscale restaurant located in the heart of downtown Burlington. The venue was notoriously exclusive, boasting a months-long waiting list and a menu completely devoid of prices. Neil and Diane selected this specific location to project dominance. They intended to utilize the intimidating ambiance of fine dining to off-balance me. They assumed the velvet drapery and crystal chandeliers would make me feel small, compliant, and eager to secure their approval. The second item was a single-page typed document bearing my father's signature. I poured the boiling water into my mug, letting the steam rise before picking up the letter. Neil did not possess the emotional vocabulary to draft a genuine apology. His letter read like a sanitized corporate press release. The paragraphs were completely saturated with passive phrasing. He wrote that mistakes were made during our previous encounters. He suggested that misunderstandings unfortunately complicated our recent communications. Not once did he accept personal accountability. He did not mention grabbing my arm at the farmer's market. He omitted Diane faking a cardiac event. He entirely ignored Connor launching a felony cyber intrusion against my agricultural cooperative. Instead, Neil positioned himself as the benevolent patriarch, offering a path toward healing. He claimed he wanted to bridge the 7-year divide and welcome me back into the fold. The final sentence summarized his true objective. He stated that true reconciliation required a unified financial vision. I set the letter aside. A unified financial vision was suburban translation for assuming their catastrophic liabilities. I picked up the third and final item. It was a thick, stapled packet titled Family Trust and Wealth Distribution Agreement. The audacity of the title alone was staggering. They possessed zero wealth to distribute. I carried the legal packet to my dining table, turning on the overhead fixture to illuminate the dense paragraphs. I retrieved my reading glasses and a fresh highlighter. I was no longer an estranged daughter reading a heartfelt olive branch. I was the financial director auditing a hostile merger proposal. I read through the preliminary pages. The initial clauses were filled with standard boilerplate language detailing asset allocation and beneficiary designations. It presented the illusion of a generous inheritance. The document stated that upon signing, I would be granted a 5% equity stake in a newly formed umbrella corporation designed to manage Naomi Core and the remaining household investments. A layperson might see that percentage and feel a rush of gratitude. They might believe their parents were finally acknowledging their worth by offering a piece of the family empire. But I knew the empire was a smoldering crater. 5% of nothing is simply nothing. I knew the trap was buried deeper in the text. Predatory contracts never display their venom on the first page. I continued reading, my eyes tracking line by line through the labyrinth of legal jargon. I flipped to page 12. There it was. Nested under a subheading labeled Shared Operational Responsibilities was a retro liability clause. The phrasing was dense, convoluted, and deliberately obfuscated by complex legal terminology. I broke down the syntax, translating the corporate speak into plain reality. The clause dictated that any beneficiary receiving equity in the new umbrella corporation immediately assumed joint and several liability for all pre-existing operational debts carried by the parent entities. Furthermore, it explicitly named Horizon Logistics as a subsidiary under this new structure. I lowered the document. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of their scheme washed over me. Horizon Logistics was the defunct shell company attached to my stolen Social Security number. The entity held the maxed-out $85,000 commercial note. The balloon payment was due in a matter of days. Neil understood that because the initial loan was secured through identity theft, he and Connor faced massive federal exposure if the bank initiated an audit. They crafted this fake reconciliation dinner to serve a singular, malicious purpose. They wanted to trick me into signing a document that legally transferred the burden of their fraud onto my shoulders. By agreeing to the 5% equity stake, I would willingly accept responsibility for the Horizon Logistics debt. I would retroactively validate the original $85,000 loan. It would wash their hands clean, erasing the identity theft entirely. The bank would legally pursue me for the balloon payment, leaving Neil and Diane free to continue their country club charade. They tried public humiliation. They tried medical blackmail. They tried cyber espionage. When every aggressive tactic failed, they wrapped a financial noose in shiny wrapping paper and labeled it an apology. They assumed I was so starved for their affection, so desperate to sit at their upscale dinner table, that I would blindly sign the contract without auditing the fine print. They believed they were incredibly smart. They had no idea they were throwing a match into a room completely devoid of oxygen. I looked down at the highlighted retro liability clause. I did not feel a familiar surge of childhood disappointment. I did not experience a fresh wave of betrayal. Instead, the corners of my mouth curled upward. I smiled. It was a cold, genuine expression of absolute victory. The timing was perfect. 24 hours ago, I executed a silent wire transfer from my blind, limited liability company in Delaware. I purchased the $85,000 Horizon Logistics debt from the secondary lenders in Chicago. I already owned the paper they were trying to trick me into assuming. By inviting me to this dinner, they were actively serving themselves on a silver platter. They provided the exact venue required to execute their ultimate destruction. I stood up from the dining table. I walked over to my home office and booted up my laptop. I navigated to the custom web address printed at the bottom of the cheap, glossy invitation. The landing page featured an elegant script, prompting guests to confirm their attendance. I filled in my details. I selected my meal preference, ensuring I requested the most expensive cut of beef available on the hidden menu. I moved my cursor over the final submission button and clicked confirm. The screen flashed a polite thank you message. I closed the laptop. The chessboard was set. Neil spent his entire life bullying people into submission using his loud voice and his perceived authority. Diane spent decades weaponizing guilt to force compliance. Naomi utilized tears and tantrums to secure unearned capital. They were about to walk into an upscale Burlington dining room, fully expecting to feast on my pristine credit score. I walked back to the kitchen and gathered the cheap, glossy envelope, the manipulative letter, and the predatory contract. I placed them inside my leather briefcase, securing the brass clasps. Tomorrow evening, I would drive down the mountain and walk into the lion's den. I would let them pour the expensive wine. I would let them deliver their fake apologies. I would sit across the white linen tablecloth and watch them spring their meticulously crafted trap. And then I would introduce them to the new owner of their entire lives. I drove out of the high elevations as the late afternoon sun cast long violet shadows across the snow. The descent into downtown Burlington marked a transition from my quiet timber sanctuary into their curated urban theater. I parked my vehicle several blocks away from the restaurant, avoiding the valet stand. I preferred a brisk walk through the freezing evening air to clear my mind before stepping into the arena. I wore a tailored navy suit. The wool blend was structured precise and entirely devoid of unnecessary embellishment. It served as corporate armor. I carried my leather briefcase, gripping the brass handle firmly. Inside that satchel rested the forged documents, the network logs, and the deed of assignment transferring their financial ruin directly into my hands. I pulled open the heavy glass doors of the dining establishment. The interior was a masterpiece of orchestrated intimidation. The lighting was impossibly dim, forcing patrons to lean close to one another. Thick velvet drapery absorbed the ambient sound, creating isolated pockets of hushed conversation. A live jazz trio played a slow, rhythmic melody in the far corner. The maitre d' greeted me, taking my coat and guiding me through the maze of occupied booths. I spotted them immediately. My blood relatives commandeered a large circular booth situated beneath a cascading crystal chandelier. They positioned themselves to be seen, projecting an aura of effortless affluence. Neil occupied the center seat, sitting with his shoulders thrown back, claiming maximum physical space. Diane sat to his right, wearing a silk blouse and a pearl necklace that caught the ambient light. Naomi and Connor occupied the adjacent chairs. Connor looked terrible. His pastel polo shirt was replaced by a stiff dress shirt that seemed half a size too small around the collar. He continuously shifted his weight, his gaze darting toward the restaurant entrance. He knew he committed a felony cyber intrusion against my network just 48 hours prior. He possessed no idea if I traced the attack back to his suburban internet protocol address. His anxiety manifested as a thin layer of perspiration gleaming on his forehead. Naomi, on the other hand, masked her desperation under layers of cosmetic bronzer and a forced bright smile. She wore designer earrings that dangled heavily, brushing her jawline whenever she turned her head. I approached the dining surface. The conversation halted. "Autumn, darling," Diane cooed, her voice rising an octave to ensure the neighboring tables heard her maternal warmth. She half stood, reaching her arms across the white linen. She intended to pull me into a theatrical embrace, an embrace designed to display our newly repaired bond to any passing waiters or wealthy patrons. I did not lean forward. I remained standing, rigid and silent, until she awkwardly lowered her arms. I slid into the singular empty chair positioned directly across from Neil. I placed my briefcase on the floor, resting the leather edge against my right boot. Diane recovered quickly, masking her rejection with a bright, artificial laugh. She reached across the cloth again, extending her manicured fingers, attempting to cover my hand with hers. "It is just so wonderful to have the family together again," she whispered, adopting a tone of deep emotional relief. I smoothly withdrew my hands, pulling them off the table and folding them securely in my lap. The physical boundary was absolute. I will not engage in tactile performances. Diane blinked her smile, faltering for a fraction of a second, before she pulled her hand back to her wine glass. Neil signaled the sommelier with a flick of his wrist. A bottle of deep red vintage already sat on the table, breathing in a crystal decanter. The server approached, pouring a fresh measure into my empty glass. The liquid was dark rich and undoubtedly commanded a price tag that exceeded a standard car payment. "Only the finest for tonight," Neil announced, swirling the crimson liquid in his goblet. "We are celebrating a new chapter." I left my glass untouched. The dramatic irony coating the room was so thick it practically restricted oxygen. They sat there, sipping a vintage they could not afford, funded by credit lines they could no longer sustain. They looked at me and saw a naive, isolated woman who finally succumbed to the crushing weight of their social exile. They believed my attendance indicated surrender. They thought I drove down from the mountains because I desperately missed their validation and craved a seat at their table. They possessed zero comprehension that I was attending a liquidation hearing. The dinner service commenced. It was an agonizing masterclass in psychological manipulation. They actively pretended the horrific events of the past week never transpired. Naomi did not mention the screeching phone call where she labeled me a bitter, lonely failure. Neil did not reference grabbing my jacket at the farmer's market. Diane acted as if the fabricated hospital photograph never existed. They curated a pristine conversational bubble, discussing trivialities like upcoming winter vacations they would never take and kitchen renovations they could never finance. Connor remained largely mute. He focused entirely on cutting his steak into microscopic pieces, avoiding my gaze. Every time I adjusted my posture, his shoulders tensed, anticipating a confrontation regarding his failed data theft. I offered him nothing. I let him marinate in his own silent terror. Neil dominated the dialogue. He spoke at length regarding his business acumen, weaving elaborate tales of market-conquering strategies and lucrative vendor negotiations. He positioned himself as the seasoned patriarch, dropping pearls of corporate wisdom for his prodigal daughter to absorb. He treated my role as a financial director like a quaint hobby, comparing my cooperative ledger management to balancing a household checkbook. I maintained a placid expression. I listened to a man lecture me on wealth generation while knowing I carried the deed to his insolvency inside a bag near my feet. The restraint required to remain silent was immense, but the impending payoff demanded patience. The waiters cleared the porcelain plates, whisking away the remnants of the main course. A busboy utilized a silver tool to sweep the breadcrumbs from the linen. The table was stripped bare, leaving only the flickering candlelight and the half-empty wine glasses. The atmosphere shifted. The meaningless chatter evaporated. Neil adjusted his posture, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the edge of the table. The time for maintaining the illusion of a casual reunion had concluded. The trap was primed. "Autumn," Neil began, his tone dropping into a serious, measured cadence. "Your mother and I have done a lot of reflecting lately. We recognize that distance grew between us over the years. We recognize that pride occasionally stood in the way of progress." He paused, waiting for me to nod or offer a reciprocal apology. I remained a statue, staring directly into his pupils. "But we are a resilient unit," Neil continued, pushing past my silence. "And resilient units protect one another. We build together. Naomi has an incredible venture ready to launch. She holds the vision. You possess the fiscal stability. Together, we can construct an empire that supports this entire table for generations." He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He extracted the stapled packet I had analyzed the night prior, the fake trust agreement, the predatory trap designed to seamlessly transfer the $85,000 identity theft onto my pristine credit profile. He placed the document onto the white tablecloth. He utilized his index finger to slowly slide the paperwork across the linen, stopping it directly in front of my folded hands. "I want you to be a recognized equal partner in this legacy," Neil stated, projecting an aura of profound generosity. "This agreement grants you a 5% equity stake in our consolidated holdings. It formally brings you back into the fold." He reached into his pocket a second time. He withdrew a heavy gold pen. The writing instrument was meant to symbolize opulent success. It was thick metallic and engineered to look expensive. But as he set it down next to the contract, the dim restaurant lighting caught the details of the casing. The gold plating near the grip was heavily tarnished. The constant friction of his fingers had worn away the false exterior, revealing the cheap, dull brass underneath. It was the perfect physical manifestation of his decaying financial empire. Shiny from a distance, but fundamentally corroded upon closer inspection. "We only require your signature," Neil said, his voice smooth, confident, and entirely devoid of hesitation. He raised his wine glass, holding it up toward the crystal chandelier. Diane and Naomi mirrored his movement, raising their goblets in a coordinated salute. Connor hesitated before lifting his glass, his hand trembling slightly, causing the red liquid to sway. "To our future," Neil declared. The three of them drank the expensive vintage, waiting for me to pick up the tarnished instrument and blindly sign my life away. They smiled, projecting warmth, love, and total victory. They believed the transaction was complete. They thought the estranged daughter was finally caught in the net. I looked down at the documents resting on the white linen. The opening scene of our final encounter had arrived. I did not touch the gold pen. I did not reach for the wine. I uncrossed my legs, slowly reaching down toward the floor to grasp the brass handle of my briefcase, preparing to execute the reversal. The three raised crystal goblets hovered over the center of the table, catching the dim ambient light. Neil, Diane, and Naomi waited for me to complete the ritual. They expected me to lift my water glass, tap the rims, and solidify my submission. I remained perfectly still. I looked at the tarnished gold pen resting beside the fraudulent trust agreement. The brass, showing through the worn plating, was a testament to a man who spent his life signing checks he could never honor. I did not touch the pen. I broke my posture, reaching down to the floor. My fingers located the dual brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed under the table, cutting through the hushed murmurs of the surrounding diners. I pulled the heavy black binder from the interior compartment. I brought it up, resting it squarely on the pristine white linen. I placed my hand flat against the dark cover and pushed. The binder slid across the table, coming to a halt mere inches from the tarnished pen. "I brought my own contract," I said. My voice was low, steady, and devoid of any emotional inflection. Neil slowly lowered his wineglass. The smug, patriarchal warmth evaporated from his features, replaced by a flicker of genuine annoyance. He did not like deviations from his script. He expected compliance, not counteroffers. He let out a short, dismissive scoff, assuming I had drafted a trivial list of personal boundaries or requested a higher equity percentage in his imaginary umbrella corporation. He reached out and flipped open the black cover. I watched his eyes. I tracked his exact cognitive process as he absorbed the primary document resting on the first page. It was the original commercial lending application from 5 years ago. He recognized the formatting immediately. He saw the logo of the hometown bank. He saw the authorizing signature belonging to his corrupt associate, Richard. Then, his gaze dropped to the bottom right corner of the page, where my forged signature looped across the dotted line. The physiological response was instantaneous. The blood drained from his face, retreating from his cheeks and leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His jaw slackened. The confident posture holding his broad shoulders aloft simply collapsed. He stopped breathing. "What is it?" Bob Diane asked, her voice tight with sudden apprehension. She leaned closer, trying to peer over his arm, but Neil rigidly blocked her view. "I turned the page for you, Neil," I suggested. His hand trembled as he gripped the edge of the heavy paper, flipping it over to reveal the second document. It was the deed of assignment, the official federal transfer log showing the movement of the $85,000 debt from the predatory secondary lender in Chicago directly to Green Mountain Acquisitions. He stared at the entity name. His mind raced, trying to calculate the variables, searching for a loophole. "Green Mountain Acquisitions is a private holding firm," I explained, keeping my tone conversational. "I established the entity 48 hours ago. I funded it utilizing my own personal capital. Yesterday morning, I purchased the Horizon Logistics commercial note. I bought the paper for 18 cents on the dollar." Neil swallowed hard. The sound was dry and audible over the jazz music. "You invited me here to sign a retro liability clause." I continued, leaning back in my chair. You intended to trick me into assuming the financial burden of an identity theft you committed 5 years ago. You wanted to pass the impending balloon payment onto my credit profile. But you cannot trick someone into buying a debt they already own. I am no longer your estranged daughter, Neil. As of yesterday morning, I am your primary creditor. The silence that descended upon our table was suffocating. The illusion of the loving family reunion shattered, leaving only the raw, exposed framework of a federal crime. Connor reached his breaking point. My brother-in-law had spent the entire evening vibrating with unexpressed terror, knowing his felony cyber intrusion was hanging in the balance. The revelation that I owned the paper tying him to the fraudulent shell company severed his final shred of composure. He gasped, reaching blindly toward his water glass to soothe his dry throat. His hand shook with severe, uncontrollable tremors. His knuckles collided with the stem of his wine goblet. The delicate crystal tipped over. The goblet struck the table with a loud, sharp clatter. Deep crimson wine spilled outward, rushing across the pristine white linen. The liquid spread rapidly, bleeding into the fabric like a fresh, expanding wound. It soaked into the bottom of the fraudulent trust agreement, staining the legal jargon a dark, bruised purple. Nobody moved to clean the spill. The spreading red stain perfectly symbolized the hemorrhage of their fake empire. "Autumn, please," Naomi stammered, her voice stripped of its confident polish. She looked at the ruined tablecloth and then at me. "You do not understand the pressure we are under. Connor and I just needed capital to keep Naomi Corps afloat. The startup costs were staggering. We meant to pay the bank back before the deadline. We never intended to hurt you. We just needed the runway to get my lifestyle brand off the ground." She reached out, placing a defensive hand on Connor's trembling shoulder. She was playing the role of the devoted wife, protecting her misunderstood husband. I shifted my gaze to my older sister. She spent her entire life stepping on my quiet achievements to elevate her own status. She treated my bank accounts like a personal emergency fund. Even now, facing the undeniable proof of federal fraud, she still clung to the narrative that this was merely a desperate business pivot gone wrong. She believed she was the protagonist in a story about entrepreneurial struggles. I felt a brief flicker of pity for her profound ignorance before I dismantled her reality. "Naomi Corps is a failing venture." I stated my words crisp and deliberate. "Your profit margins are non-existent and your inventory is a fiction. But your fake lifestyle brand did not consume $85,000. Naomi frowned, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The consulting fees went to Connor to manage the vendor logistics." "Connor is incompetent," I replied, maintaining eye contact with my sister. "He possesses zero ability to manage supply chains." But he did not drain the LLC. He merely operated the accounts to wash the funds. I reached across the stained tablecloth and flipped to the third page in the black binder. It was the deep audit I conducted, utilizing the unredacted routing numbers Diane so foolishly provided. It was a comprehensive ledger detailing the final destination of every single dollar withdrawn from the Horizon Logistics line of credit. The money did not go to vendor logistics, I explained. The funds were wired directly into offshore holding accounts. From those holding accounts, the capital was dispersed into digital wallets tied to online sports books, high-stakes card tables, and private, unregulated bookies. Naomi stared at the ledger. She read the names of the casinos. She read the staggering daily transfer limits. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She slowly turned her head, looking away from the binder and staring directly at her father. Neil sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table. He refused to meet her eyes. "Your husband is the scapegoat, Naomi," I said. delivering the final, devastating truth. Connor signed the digital transfer logs, but Neil authorized the transactions. Your father possesses a severe, crippling gambling addiction. He blew through his own liquid assets years ago. When the suburban facade threatened to collapse, he stole my identity to secure a fresh line of credit. He utilized your husband to mask the digital trail. He funded his bets using my name, and he planned to use your fake business to cover his tracks. The atmosphere at the table imploded. Diane let out a sharp, ragged gasp, pressing both hands against her mouth. She stared at Neil, her eyes wide with a horrified, sickening realization. Diane worshipped social status above all other metrics. She tolerated Neil's bullying because he provided the opulent home, the luxury vehicles, and the country club memberships. The revelation that their wealth was a hollow mirage, sustained by stolen funds and degenerate gambling, decimated her entire worldview. The patriarch she protected was a fraud, who gambled away their sanctuary. Naomi pulled her hand away from Connor's shoulder as if his fabric suddenly burned her skin. She looked at her husband, the man who willingly participated in the scheme to bankrupt her sister just to appease his father-in-law. Then she looked back at Neil. The golden child finally realized she was never a cherished daughter. She was merely a convenient prop, a convenient excuse to secure more capital for the betting tables. The myth of our family loyalty disintegrated into dust. The lectures on duty, the demands for respect, the endless speeches regarding the importance of bloodlines were all elaborate mechanisms designed to feed a singular, toxic addiction. They were all pawns in his game, and I was the bank he chose to rob. I watched the devastation settle over their features. The jazz trio continued their rhythmic melody, oblivious to the empire collapsing in the corner booth. I sat tall in my tailored suit, unbothered by the spreading wine stain, untouched by their sprawling misery. I had promised myself I would elevate the conflict beyond emotional manipulation, and I had succeeded. Neil finally looked up, his eyes hollow and defeated. The bluster was gone. The intimidating volume was silenced. He was just a tired, desperate man staring at the end of his road. I reached into the binder and pulled out the final document, preparing to deliver the closing terms of their surrender. The heavy silence reigning over our corner booth could not last. Neil possessed a fragile ego built entirely on a foundation of unearned authority. When a narcissist is cornered by undeniable facts, they do not experience remorse. They experience rage. He needed to reconstruct his shattered reality, and he reverted to the only tool he truly understood: intimidation. This is a fabrication. Neil hissed, his voice vibrating with a sudden ferocious energy. He slammed his open palm against the edge of the dining table. The silverware clattered against the porcelain plates. The spilled red wine pooled further across the white linen, dripping silently onto the patterned carpet. "You sit here and think you can humiliate me in public?" he sneered, leaning across the stained fabric. "You printed a few fake ledgers and expect me to bow down? I will ruin you, Autumn. I have top-tier attorneys on retainer who will drown you in litigation. I will sue you for defamation. I will sue you for corporate sabotage. I will drag your little agricultural cooperative into a courtroom and drain your assets until you are begging for a settlement." Diane nodded rapidly, finding desperate comfort in his returning bluster. She clutched her pearl necklace, staring at me with a mixture of terror and renewed defiance. "We will take everything from you," Diane whispered, her voice trembling. "You cannot treat your family this way." I watched them perform their final desperate theater. They were attempting to extinguish a forest fire using a spray bottle. I waited for Neil to expend his remaining oxygen. I let his threats hang in the ambient air, mingling with the soft jazz melody drifting from the stage. I felt no elevated pulse. I felt no fear. When his chest heaved and his face turned a mottled shade of purple, I delivered the structural blow. "You cannot sue the bank, Neil," I said, keeping my vocal cadence flat and rhythmic. "And as of yesterday morning, I am the bank." His jaw tightened, but he did not speak. I reached into the black leather binder one last time. I bypassed the audit ledgers and the forged applications, extracting a thin manila folder. I opened it and extracted 2 pristine legal documents, laying them side by side on the dry portion of the tablecloth. "These are not proposals," I stated, sliding the papers toward him. "These are the terms of your surrender." Neil looked down at the bold, printed headers. His eyes darted across the legal phrasing, his bravado melting away as the reality of the text registered in his mind. "The document on your left is a deed in lieu of foreclosure," I explained. "It functions as the voluntary transfer of collateral. By signing that paper, you immediately surrender the deed to your suburban estate, your remaining luxury vehicles, and all liquid equity associated with the Horizon Logistics Shell Company, directly to Green Mountain Acquisitions. It bypasses the civil courts entirely. It makes me the sole legal owner of your entire curated life." Diane let out a sharp, strangled sob. "The house," she cried, her hands flying to her cheeks. "You cannot take the house, Autumn! Where will we live? How will I explain this to my social circle?" "You can tell them you downsized," I suggested, refusing to look at her. "Or you can tell them your husband gambled your sanctuary away on high-stakes sports bets. The narrative is entirely yours to craft." I pointed to the second document. "The paper on your right is a confessed judgment of fraud. It contains a detailed admission of the $85,000 identity theft, the money laundering through Naomi Kaur, and the recent cyber espionage attempt against my network. It holds you criminally liable." "You are out of your mind," Neil spat, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "I will never sign a confession. I will walk out of this restaurant right now, and you can try your luck in front of a judge." I anticipated that response. I slowly raised my right hand, resting my elbow on the armrest, and extended my index finger, pointing across the dim dining room. "I suggest you look toward the mahogany bar," I said quietly. Neil turned his head following my gesture. Connor and Naomi turned as well, tracking my line of sight through the maze of velvet booths. Sitting on a leather bar stool, nursing a glass of club soda with lime, was Thomas. The senior federal financial crimes investigator wore his standard heavy wool sweater and wire-rimmed glasses. He did not look like a patron enjoying a casual evening. He looked like a predator watching a trapped animal. He held a thick manila envelope resting on his lap. It was the exact package of unredacted evidence I provided him earlier that afternoon. When Thomas saw Neil looking at him, he offered a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. "That man is a senior investigator for a federal task force," I informed my family. "He possesses the identical evidence packet sitting on this table. He is waiting for my signal. If you stand up and walk away from this booth, I will raise my hand. He will detain you before you reach the ballet stand. You will spend the night in a holding cell, and you will spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary." The threat of prison crushed the remaining air from the table. The abstract concept of litigation vanished, replaced by the immediate physical presence of federal law enforcement. Connor broke first. My brother-in-law understood his specific legal exposure. The phishing script he deployed against my cooperative was a documented federal cybercrime. He lacked the psychological armor Neil spent decades building. Connor was a coward who liked expensive golf clubs, not a hardened criminal prepared to serve a mandatory sentence. "Give me the paper," Connor pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. He lunged forward, reaching across Naomi to grab the confessed judgment. "I will sign it. I had nothing to do with the original identity theft. Neil made me wash the funds. I will testify to whatever you want. Autumn, just do not let that man arrest me." "Connor, stop it!" Naomi shrieked, grabbing his wrist. "You are signing away our entire lives!" "We possess no lives!" Naomi Connor shouted, pulling his arm free. "We are bankrupt! Your father ruined us, and your sister owns us! I am not going to a concrete cell for a fake lifestyle brand." Neil watched his son-in-law crumble. The patriarch realized his empire was gone. The loyalty he demanded his entire life dissolved the moment his fraudulent foundation was exposed. He possessed zero leverage, zero capital, and zero allies. He looked at me, his eyes hollow and defeated. He wanted to retain one final fraction of control, one microscopic shred of dominance over the transaction. "I will sign the deed," Neil whispered, his voice carrying the texture of crushed gravel. "But I am doing this to protect my wife, not because you won." He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved the heavy gold pen. The tarnished instrument was his signature tool, the item he used to authorize bad loans, intimidate subordinates, and project fake wealth. He clicked the top mechanism. He placed the metallic tip against the signature line of the deed in lieu of foreclosure. He pressed down hard, dragging the pen across the white paper. No ink flowed. Neil froze. He pressed harder, scribbling a frantic, invisible circle in the margin. The dry metal tip merely scratched the paper, carving deep, colorless grooves into the surface. The ink cartridge was entirely empty. The gold pen was dead. It was a flawless, poetic reflection of his current existence. A shiny, heavy exterior containing absolutely nothing of value inside. He stared at the dry grooves, his breathing ragged. The humiliation of that failed signature broke the final pillar of his ego. His shoulders slumped forward, his chin dropping toward his chest. I reached into my blazer pocket. I extracted the cheap blue plastic promotional pen I took from the cooperative. It was the exact same functional 10-cent tool I utilized to audit their fraudulent PDF statements by the warmth of my cabin fire. It was lightweight, unpretentious, and highly reliable. I placed the blue plastic pen on the stained tablecloth and slid it across the linen. "Function over form," I stated quietly. Connor snatched the plastic pen immediately. He scrawled his name across the confession of fraud, his handwriting a messy, panicked sprawl. He pushed the documents toward Neil, his hands shaking violently. "Sign it, Neil," Connor begged. "Please." Neil stared at the cheap blue plastic resting on the paper. He slowly reached out, picking up the tool. His large hand dwarfed the thin casing. He positioned the ballpoint against the designated line. The blue ink flowed perfectly smooth and uninterrupted. He signed his name, surrendering his sprawling estate, his luxury vehicles, and his entire fabricated legacy. He dropped the pen onto the table as if it burned his fingers. The transaction was complete. I gathered the signed legal documents, ensuring every signature matched the required fields. I tapped the edges of the paper against the table, aligning them with an auditor's precision. I slid the paperwork into my leather briefcase and secured the brass clasps. The deed was done. The legal barrier was permanent, impenetrable, and fully executed. I looked at the 4 people sitting across from me, trapped in a prison of their own design, knowing I would never have to speak to them again. I secured the brass clasps on my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic snaps cut through the lingering silence at the table, echoing like a gavel striking a wooden block. The transaction was over. Neil sat paralyzed, his broad shoulders sunken, staring blankly at the spreading red wine stain on the white linen. Diane wept softly into a cloth napkin, mourning the death of her social status. Connor refused to lift his gaze from his lap, while Naomi stared at me with wide, hollow eyes, finally comprehending that the safety net she relied on her entire life was permanently severed. They expected a monologue. They anticipated a dramatic villain's speech where I listed every grievance, every missed birthday, every snide comment they ever delivered. They thought I would revel in their destruction. But indulging in dramatic monologues requires emotional investment, and my emotional ledger regarding these 4 individuals was entirely zeroed out. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored navy blazer. I extracted a slim leather wallet. I opened the fold and pulled out 4 crisp $1 bills. I placed the currency on the only remaining dry corner of the tablecloth. "That is for my sparkling water," I stated, my vocal cadence remaining low and rhythmic. "I prefer to clear my own accounts. I do not owe you a single cent, and you will never hear from me again." I picked up my briefcase from the floor. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the corner booth and walked away. I navigated the maze of velvet seating and crystal chandeliers. The live jazz trio continued their slow melody, providing a surreal soundtrack to the collapse of a suburban empire. I approached the long mahogany bar near the entrance. Thomas sat on his leather stool, nursing his club soda. As I passed behind him, I met his gaze in the mirrored reflection behind the liquor bottles. I offered him a single shallow nod. Thomas returned the gesture, lifting his glass a fraction of an inch. He understood the signal. The legal surrender was executed. He would hold the federal evidence packet in deep storage, a silent deterrent, ensuring Neil and Connor never attempted to retaliate or challenge the asset transfer. The trap was locked, and the key was thrown into a bottomless ocean. The maitre d' handed me my insulated winter coat. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping out of the orchestrated intimidation of the dining room and into the frigid Burlington night. The winter air hit my face with a sharp, honest bite. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the freezing oxygen. It tasted like absolute freedom. I walked the 4 blocks to my parked vehicle. The snow crunched beneath my boots, a steady, grounding rhythm. For the first time in 31 years, I did not feel the phantom weight of familial expectation pressing down on my cervical spine. The invisible tether connecting me to their toxic demands was legally and permanently dissolved. I started my engine, turned the heater on, and drove back up the winding roads toward the higher elevations, leaving the wreckage of their curated lives far behind me. Friday morning broke with brilliant, blinding sunlight reflecting off the Green Mountains. I arrived at the cedar-lined administrative wing of the agricultural cooperative before the junior staff booted their computers. I poured a mug of dark roast coffee and sat at my desk opening the thick black binder. It was time to execute the final bureaucratic maneuvers. I initiated a secure portal connection to the county clerk corresponding to my hometown. I scanned the signed deed in lieu of foreclosure and uploaded the digital file into the federal property registry. I paid the standard processing fee using a corporate card. The system processed the document, generating a digital receipt and an official seal. The transfer of ownership was recorded into the public domain. The sprawling suburban estate, the luxury vehicles, and all remaining liquid equity belonging to Neil and Diane were officially titled to Green Mountain Acquisitions. I drafted a brief, sterile email to a specialized property liquidation firm located in their jurisdiction. I provided the legal deed and authorized them to initiate the eviction protocol. Neil and Diane possessed exactly 30 days to pack their personal belongings and vacate the premises. If they failed to comply, the liquidation agency would arrive with local law enforcement to change the locks and seize the structure. I instructed the firm to auction the house and the vehicles, utilizing the generated revenue to clear the original $85,000 identity theft debt. The arithmetic of their ruin was flawless. But the asset portfolio contained one additional property, an item cross-collateralized against the initial fraudulent loan. It was a Summer Lake house, situated in a highly exclusive, gated community in upstate New York. That lake house was the crown jewel of my mother's false identity. Diane spent decades hosting superficial mixer events on that cedar deck, pouring expensive champagne for wealthy neighbors while complaining about the working-class individuals who maintained the grounds. She treated that property like a royal court, utilizing the zip code to project a level of elite superiority she never actually earned. The standard financial procedure dictated I instruct the liquidation firm to sell the lake house for a high cash return. But I am an architect of sustainable growth, and I recognize the profound value of poetic justice. I opened a separate legal drafting software. I generated a commercial deed of gift. I transferred the title of the elite upstate lake house away from Green Mountain Acquisitions. I legally donated the entire property, including the private dock and the surrounding acreage, directly to the Vermont Agricultural Cooperative. I filed the paperwork classifying the donation as a philanthropic tax deduction for my private holding company, optimizing my own fiscal portfolio while executing a flawless structural shift. The cooperative board of directors received the notification before noon. I included a detailed proposal regarding the utility of the new asset. The pristine, superficial vacation home would be repurposed immediately. It would serve as a fully funded educational retreat and lodging facility for our regional artisan farmers, soil scientists, and dairy laborers. The irony was exquisite. The very sanctuary Diane utilized to mock the working class would now house individuals who earned their living through hard, honest labor. I pictured Elias, the cooperative president, walking through her curated living room in his mud-stained work boots, setting his greasy thermoses on her imported marble countertops to discuss seasonal crop rotations. The ultimate monument to her snobbery was legally transformed into a sanctuary for the exact people she spent her life despising. It was a morally pristine victory constructed entirely within the boundaries of federal tax law. The workday concluded with a steady, reassuring hum of organizational efficiency. I reviewed the final crop yield projections approved, the inbound vendor invoices, and locked my office door. I walked out to my vehicle as the evening shadow stretched across the snow-covered fields. I drove the familiar route back to my cabin. The winding road navigated through dense forests of bare maples and towering pines. The sky transitioned from a pale, bruised purple into a deep, endless charcoal. The headlights of my vehicle cut through the gathering dark, illuminating the heavy flakes of snow beginning to drift down from the clouds. I pulled into my gravel driveway. The cabin stood quiet and sturdy against the winter landscape. I unlocked the front door, stepping into the warm, wood smoke-scented interior. I removed my insulated boots, setting them neatly on the rubber mat by the entrance. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of cold, filtered water. I set the glass on the granite counter and reached into my pocket, withdrawing my cell phone. The screen illuminated. The notification badge hovered over the phone icon, a stubborn digital reminder of the chaos that attempted to breach my walls earlier that week. 43 unheard voicemails sat in the inbox. A frantic, hysterical chorus of manipulation, guilt, and fabricated emergencies. I did not press play. I did not need to hear Naomi breathing heavily into the receiver. I did not need to listen to the rising panic in her tone as she realized the old tactics were failing. Their voices no longer carried any weight. They were simply ghosts trapped inside a cellular network, screaming into a void that refused to answer. I tapped the voicemail icon. I navigated to the administrative menu. I selected the edit function, highlighting the entire block of stored audio files. I pressed the delete button. The system prompted me for a final confirmation, warning me that the action was permanent and the data could not be recovered. I did not hesitate. I confirmed the deletion. The screen refreshed. The red notification badge vanished. The digital inbox was entirely empty. I placed the phone face down on the granite counter. I walked away from the device, moving into the living room. I stood before the large picture window framing the eastern view of the property. I turned off the interior lamp, allowing my eyes to adjust to the natural illumination provided by the moon reflecting off the landscape. The snow was falling at a steady, silent pace. The heavy white flakes descended in thick curtains, covering the driveway, coating the branches of the ancient pines, and smoothing out the rugged terrain of the Green Mountains. The fresh powder erased every footprint, every tire track, and every imperfection on the ground. It was a flawless, unbroken canvas. I stood in the quiet warmth of my cabin, watching the ice preserve the forest. I had faced the consuming fire of their entitlement, and I had extinguished it with cold, unarguable precision. My boundaries were no longer theoretical concepts negotiated over tense holiday dinners. They were physical, legal, and impenetrable realities. I built a life where respect was earned through honest labor, and I protected that life using the very tools my father mocked me for pursuing. The snowfall continued blanketing the world in a deep, profound stillness. I took a slow, even breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. The frantic noise of the past was gone. My ledgers were balanced, my sanctuary was secure, and my life was wonderfully, perfectly quiet. We are raised on a very specific, deeply ingrained American myth. It is the belief that the traditional family structure is an unbreakable sanctuary, a white picket fortress where unconditional love flows naturally from parent to child. We are taught that blood is the ultimate currency, a sacred tether that binds us through hardship, failure, and time. But what happens when that currency is counterfeit? What happens when the people entrusted with our emotional and moral development view us not as children to be nurtured, but as assets to be leveraged? The story of Autumn Patel is not just a gripping thriller of financial revenge. It is a profound, devastating mirror held up to the darkest corners of modern parenting. It asks us to examine the terrifying gap between the appearance of family responsibility and the reality of emotional exploitation. In American culture, there is a dangerous tendency to confuse provision with parenting. We measure successful child-rearing by the metrics of zip codes, college tuitions, and the pristine manicured lawns that separate our homes from the outside world. Neil and Diane, like so many parents chasing the illusion of the suburban dream, believed that supplying a sprawling house, expensive boots, and a country club membership fulfilled their parental covenant. They curated a flawless exterior. Yet beneath that glossy synthetic cardstock, their foundation was entirely devoid of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. They raised their children in an ecosystem where value was measured in status rather than integrity, and where manipulation was disguised as duty. To raise a child within a traditional family structure is not merely to feed and clothe them. It is to engage in the terrifying daily work of emotional mirroring. It requires a parent to possess the humility to admit when they are wrong, the integrity to enforce rules equitably, and the wisdom to recognize that a child is an independent soul, not a retirement plan or an emotional sponge. When this emotional awareness is absent, the family home transforms from a sanctuary into a transactional marketplace. Love becomes conditional, doled out only when the child serves the overarching narrative of parental success. This is the tragedy of failing to provide long-term moral guidance. When a family operates without a baseline of emotional truth, the children warp to fit the dysfunction in order to survive. Consider Naomi. As the golden child, she was protected from consequence, showered with unearned capital, and taught that her desires superseded reality. Society often looks at the favored child with envy, but the story reveals the insidious damage of such favoritism. The result was a woman utterly crippled by her own entitlement, unable to sustain a business, a marriage, or her own morality. She became a hollow extension of her parents' ego, completely unequipped for the rigorous demands of the real world. By sheltering her from failure, her parents guaranteed her ultimate ruin. Then there is Autumn, the quiet gap filler. The daughter who was expected to shrink into the background until her pristine credit score was required to save the crumbling empire. In traditional family structures, fairness is the invisible mortar that holds the bricks together. When parents exhibit blatant favoritism, when they punish independence and reward dependency, they do not just fracture sibling relationships, they destroy the child's fundamental trust in the world. Autumn learned early that she was on her own. But ironically, it was this very neglect, this cold exile, that forged her unbreakable resilience. By pushing her out into the freezing reality of the world, her father inadvertently gave her the tools to survive him. She replaced the chaotic emotional quicksand of her upbringing with the undeniable solid ground of data, mathematics, and self-reliance. Parenting at its core is the ultimate act of long-term stewardship. It is the responsibility to raise human beings who can navigate the world with a strong internal compass, grounded in accountability and self-awareness. When parents like Neil resort to forging federal documents in their daughter's name, or when mothers like Diane fake cardiac emergencies to extract wire transfers, they are not just committing crimes. They are committing the ultimate spiritual betrayal. They are teaching their children that love is a predatory transaction, and that vulnerability is merely a weakness to be exploited. Society conditions us to believe that no matter the transgression, we must endlessly forgive our parents. We are raised on adages that demand loyalty to the bloodline above all else. We are told to turn the other cheek to keep the peace, to maintain the family portrait at all costs, especially in cultures that venerate the traditional family unit as the cornerstone of civilization. But Autumn's narrative forces us to confront an incredibly unconventional truth. Sometimes, keeping the peace is just another phrase for enabling abuse. There is a profound, radical morality in saying no. We are conditioned to view familial estrangement as a tragic failure, a broken branch on the family tree that must be mended at the expense of our own mental health. But the truth that defies conventional thinking is this: estrangement is not always a tragedy. Sometimes it is the cure. Cutting off a toxic bloodline is an act of supreme self-preservation and profound emotional honesty. It is the realization that you cannot heal a wound while the knife is still in it, even if the hand holding the knife belongs to the man who gave you his last name. Autumn did not destroy her family. She simply audited them, presented them with the ledger of their own choices, and refused to pay their debts. She broke generational trauma not by fixing her parents, but by rendering them entirely powerless over her future. True family responsibility does not mean offering yourself up as collateral for someone else's dysfunction. It means having the courage to demand honesty and the strength to walk away when the only thing being offered is a lie. We must look deeply at how we are raising the next generation. Are we cultivating genuine emotional awareness, teaching our children to respect boundaries, to value truth over appearances, and to understand that their worth is not tied to their utility? Or are we like Neil and Diane, frantically polishing the tarnished brass of our own egos, hoping no one notices that the ink has run dry? If this reflection resonates with you, if you have ever had to audit the emotional ledgers of your own life, or if you simply appreciate stories that dig beneath the surface of our everyday illusions to find the empowering truth beneath, please follow Amanda Told Stories. We explore the complex, often hidden truths of human relationships, bringing light to the quiet battles fought behind closed doors so that no one has to feel they are walking in the dark alone. As the snow falls on a quiet cabin in Vermont, burying the footprints of the past beneath a pristine white blanket, we are left with a lingering, echoing question. Autumn purchased her freedom with clinical precision, locking the steel cage around the ghosts of her childhood. She won the war. She is safe, secure, and untouchable in her sanctuary of pine and wood smoke. But when you spend your entire life building a fortress to keep the monsters out, and you finally succeed in vanquishing them completely, what remains inside the walls? When the noise stops and the snow settles, and the only heartbeat left in the freezing woods is your own, you must ask yourself a terrifying question. Does survival eventually turn into a different kind of solitude? The hardest truth to swallow isn't that the people who are supposed to love us can break us. The hardest truth is that in the process of making ourselves completely unbreakable, we might just forget how to let anyone else in. Peace is a beautiful, necessary achievement, but an empty room is still empty, no matter whose name is printed on the deed.